Good morning, Will.
Good morning, Brother Rich. How are you today?
I'm ready for a good Labor Day, my friend. How about you?
Yes, you as well. Happy Labor Day, and looking forward to getting some relaxation time in here after the this morning show.
Yeah, sounds good. And this morning's show, why don't you tell us how this came about?
Well, um, as many things in life that I think are going to be a good thing here, kind of by accident.
Mm,
So my daughter is become quite the history buff, and she and I have had many long conversations about history and how not everything is told in the history book or is, in my opinion, correctly handled by the modern narrative. And one night we were up late having a talk and about the Civil War,
mm,
and I was like, "You want to do a Civil War trip this coming summer?" And this discussion was probably February, March of this year, and she's like, "Yeah, I think it'd be fun." And I thought that'd be great. So we took a family Civil War trip down. We started down in Chattanooga at Chickamauga and did some other stuff down there. Went to the aquarium because that's a great thing if anybody happens to be in that area. And just happened to know somebody who lives down in that neighborhood. And that'd
mm.
be our brother Rich Brown and his wonderful family hosted us for an evening of breaking bread and wonderful conversation. And then we went on after that to Franklin and
Mm,
then Shiloh, and then
mm.
worked our way back home from there. And and that of course spurred lots of conversations between you and I as well. And the we'll get into it in the show, but I was my perceptions of the Civil War have changed certainly,
Mhm.
but it really got me thinking about how these things are handled, um, how they're taught, how they're perceived. I don't want to give away too much of the show here, and what I kind of how my thought process changed, and it's certainly a lot of great information from you over well the last on this subject over maybe the last year. You and I have talked about it on and
Mhm.
off. So that's a whole how the whole idea of this came together, and then what the large framework of the show is this morning. I mentioned to you one day. I said, why don't we do a Civil War show, but not your standard, you know, Union versus Confederate. I want to look at it from the different perspectives. I was born
Mm,
in Iowa, raised in Illinois, live in Wisconsin, and um, read the history books,
mm.
you know,
That
and
were
it was,
provided to you by the winning
yes,
side.
yes. And I have an
Yes.
interesting perspective on that as
Mhm.
well. At
Mm,
least I think it's interesting. And and of course you grew up with a different perspective being a southerner,
mhm.
and that's really where I think we can provide some value in today's show, because anybody can go read a history book from either side and get that, but just the way the assumptions that are made, because that's just the way it's always been, right? um the assumptions I had about the Civil War, many were wrong. And um, so I think it's good for us to examine that. It also dovetails into, you know, current day politics. As
Mhm.
from that, not so much the politics themselves, but the media coverage and how people, and including me for a long time, were very siloed. You're a Fox News guy, you're a CNN guy, you're an MSNBC guy.
Mhm.
I only listen to mainstream news because at one point Walter Cronkite was on there, and
Yeah.
you know, so it's. I think it's. I'm really interested to dig in this. I think I know much of what you're going to say because we had a great conversation that evening at your home,
Mhm.
and have had other conversations. But I'm really interested to see where this goes.
All right, cool, man. Well, I am too. Put a lot of work into this. Been studying the Civil War pretty aggressively probably since 2000. So it's a subject that's near and dear to my heart. I can obviously speak at about it without notes, but one of the things I mostly studied is the war breaks out, and then what? And then the justification for that was I spent my entire life in my adult life in the military, 23 years
Hmm.
in the Marines, and so I looked at it from that lens
Hmm.
as a tactical and strategic and operational levels of warfare, because it has a lot to teach us there. And only kind of recently have I been interested in the causes because, as you alluded to, well, I think we see some of the same things here, some of the
Mhm.
same passions at
Mhm.
work that are flaming division. And we'll definitely dive into that. But first, let's welcome
Yes.
some folks onto the show. We got John
Yes.
Shriver on. Who else we got?
We got Will Parker, part of the Will Club. He's from Montana,
Hmm.
coin number 800. Bruce is on from Michigan, coin 481. Another member of the Will Club, Will Rhodes from Missouri. Your state's going to come up a little bit today with the Missouri Compromise. Coin number
Yeah.
2269. What's that coin thing there, brother?
I'm glad you asked. Becoming a coin member of the American Warrior Society is how you get access to the training vault and all the training programs within there, like firearms, less lethal. When I say firearms, I'm talking about shotgun, rifle, handgun, you name it. It probably should have a slingshot module, then we'd have everything covered. But um, take a free 14-day test drive. If you've heard mine and Will's voice for a long time, man, I encourage you to take that test drive.
Mhm.
And if not, what I really want you to do is leave us a review, man. If you've enjoyed the content for some time, go on iTunes, leave us a review. Yes, it's easy to click the little stars and move on, but I would really encourage you to write a lengthy review. That's how people find us. That's how the algorithms work, guys. And I would
Mhm.
really appreciate that. Craig Holland says, "Good afternoon, Yankee traders." There's only one Yankee here today, Craig.
Mm.
So, man, it's this guy.
I believe it's what is it? Ungrateful. What's the term that comes
Columnist.
up every? Yes, yes.
Oh,
Thank you.
yeah.
Yes, columns. Yes.
Ted is on from Mississippi. Good morning, Will. Derek is on from North Carolina. Okay, we're going to jump into the show, man, and I'm going to let you kind of take it away.
Okay.
Will's got a few slides to talk about from his perspective,
Mhm.
and then I'm going to dive into and examine my top 10 causes for the Civil War, and then we'll look at parallels that we see perhaps today.
Awesome. So we're gonna start with a disclaimer. As Rich and I were leading up this show, we both of us have said one derivative of, let's face it, we're two middle-aged white guys talking about the Civil War. So disclaimers right up front. Enslaving people is wrong. Nobody's advocating for that, no matter what we say about one side or the other, the behaviors of one side or the other. Um, it includes me, you, and the American Warrior Society. We're not
Amen.
advocating for condoning slavery, past, present, future, any of that stuff. What we want to dig into today is evaluate the differing perspectives of the American Civil War, and then how media, school books, education systems have furthered that divide over generations now.
Yes.
And also look at the events preceding it, which is more what Rich is going to dig into. You and a little bit of me at the end of the show, and also then the aftermath. And the aftermath of that does include um, Reconstruction and the. I think I have a couple interesting anecdotes from our trip because in the past, um, when we went on trips like this, I kind of stayed away from the guided tours.
Mm,
Part of that is I'm cheap. Okay. The other part of it was that I would read a lot before we go someplace. Well, I have definitely changed my opinion on that after this trip because there was no way I could take in all the information about these places ahead of time. So we paid for these guided tours, and holy moly, did we learn a lot from these people? Some very very knowledgeable men and women who guided us through these places. I really encourage you guys to consider that. If you were like I was with that. That's just going to become part of the vacation budget when we go places now.
well, you say, well, I'm going to read about it. There's over 60,000 books written about the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
60,000 about the American Civil War alone.
Mm-hmm.
So you just can't consume all the content. And so, yeah, I think that's a great point you point out there, Will. So, yeah, there you
So
go.
we're retiring the
Oh,
tinfoil
there we
hat.
go.
There we go.
We go.
All right, Johnny Reb. All
Well,
right,
let's do it.
today, North versus the South here. We got Lincoln versus Jefferson Davis. And, the first thing that it oddly struck me, and I'm sure it was in a history book at some point when I was a kid, but I looked at the American flag at the start of the Civil War, and I was shocked to see what's up there on the screen right now.
Hmm.
Now, I probably learned it for a test and brain dumped it 42 seconds after that in about fourth grade. which was a long, long time ago. But it just one of those things right away, right?
Mhm.
So so this let's just dive right into it here. Get on the next one.
Okay.
Um,
Can we talk
and
about this
we'll
real quick?
yeah, yeah.
When I saw this, I'm like, man, I wish he hadn't used because that's not the flag of the Confederacy.
Mm-hmm.
That's the Confederate battle flag
Yes.
flown in war. Our
Mm-hmm.
actual flag looks somewhat like the flag of North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Yep.
it's a bit of a misnomer, but
Well,
everybody
and
associates that with
yes,
yeah. And if, one final thing on this,
yeah,
as Craig
please.
will probably quickly point out, this is drawn from the flag of Scotland. That's
Oh, is
St.
it?
Andrew's Cross, because
Okay.
most of the folks in the South were from Scotland, so they're going back to their heritage using the Scotland flag. So
Interesting. Now,
yeah,
I did not know that. Well, and the reason I chose that flight because I am aware of that after this trip and after our discussions, but it goes to that perception, right?
hmm
And we can certainly, I bet everybody on here, the names I saw, can tell us why we can't buy that flag anymore on Amazon, but we can buy an ISIS flag.
are you serious? I did not know that.
Yeah, yeah.
Holy
Of course,
crap!
we're talking about the church shooting in, I believe, it was South Carolina,
Yeah, Dylan
2012 ish.
Roof. Yeah.
Yeah, and after that, Amazon stopped selling the Confederate battle flag. But at that time, I haven't checked in a number of years now. You could still buy an ISIS flag on Amazon.
Unbelievable.
Yep. Um, Will, we are going to talk a little bit about Shiloh today, and that was a very sobering experience there. That one, I was surprised. I'll throw in a little anecdote with that one. No guided tours there. It's a auto
hmm
tour, very well done. You listen through an app, very well done, but no guided tours there.
Hmm.
So, what's Craig have to say?
Craig says your Civil War. Now, Craig, of course, is in the UK. If you're listening to the podcast later, it says your Civil War and our Civil War seems to be divided between North versus South. Very much still same today. Yeah. And Craig, here in a second, I'm going to have a map of the British Isles to show what parts of the British Isles fed into America and why some of those divides are still alive here in the U.S. today, hundreds of years later. And
Yes.
Mark is in Australia. Thank you for being on, guys. Please like and hit that share button, sir. Go ahead.
Okay. So, northern perspective, and this is not really in any order, but this was my perception. Maybe not so much in the
Mhm.
last number of years, but especially growing up through school, and then didn't really think about it much until oh gosh, probably went 20 years without really thinking much about the Civil War, other than anecdotes here and there. All right, so northern perspective here. Slavery is evil and must be stopped. Of course, we can all agree on that in modern day, right?
Sure.
Um, Southern states and Southern whites are greedy and evil
Mm.
because otherwise, why would you enslave people to grow your crops, right?
Yep.
Slave owners continuously beat, rape, and generally abuse their slaves because that's what was in the books. And I can't swear to the fact that it was in a textbook, but for sure, there were pictures of the whippings and the beatings, and pictures of the scarred backs and so on and so forth. White Southerners use slavery to maintain wealth and power that they themselves are too lazy to work for.
Mhm.
All Southerners support slavery because that one I do remember being taught. Maybe not all, but the vast majority, probably 80-85% is best estimate I could give.
Sure.
Southern states consistently block efforts to end slavery. Therefore, the only way to end it is through force. And that one, there's, we'll just leave that as it is for now. We'll
Yeah.
get into
That
discussion.
speaks for
Okay.
itself. Yeah.
All right. All right.
Yeah.
Abraham Lincoln must use extraordinary measures to maintain the war effort.
Yep.
Okay.
And some of those
Lincoln.
were, as we've talked about many times before, repeal of habeas corpus,
Mhm.
and a lot of things that when I talk about it, I'll view them as tyrannical, but we'll get to that in due course.
Yep. Sure. Yep. And yep. Lincoln was willing to allow slavery to remain intact in the current slave states, but not allow new states to allow slavery. Wow, I made that as wordy as possible, didn't I?
Mhm.
Um, this would have allowed, this is a little bit of my opinion here, this would have allowed slavery to be phased out over time, but the southern states weren't open to it. This is where we get into the Missouri Compromise, where it had to be a
Mhm.
1-for-1. One state slavery, one state non slavery, as those states chose. And then that morphed into all new states had to be non-slave, had to be free states. And of course, over time, congressional power would shift with that, and in essence, a sunset, inevitable sunset.
Mhm.
Um, in the end, the Union prevailed because they were on the right side of history.
Amen.
Yep. To this day, and this is my perspective now, and this was and going
Now
ahead,
or in years previously?
um, years previously, and when I say now, I mean like within a year ago.
Okay.
Okay. Why doesn't the South just get over it? You lost.
Mm.
Move on. Right. I mean, slavery was wrong. You lost. Tough cookies. Right. Why can't excuse me? Why can't Southerners see that slavery was evil and they were just on the wrong side of history?
Mm.
Okay. And I do have some anecdotes from our trip down south there about both of those. Yes, Lincoln did suspend the writ of habeas corpus, but that is constitutional. And
Yes, it
this is
is.
a short bit out of the Constitution, and I will admit, taken out of context here. Okay, when quote when in cases of rebellion or invasion. Okay, and there's
Yep.
there's more to that part, but that's basically all I was ever taught. Okay, that I can recall. Okay,
Yeah.
next one there, I think. Okay, so I think we hit that one towards the end after you do your stuff. Okay.
Okay.
That's more of the. So if you go back one, I do want to throw in um, the suspending the writ of habeas corpus. Now, I will admit, even up through high school, I had very little interest in history because of the way it was taught. It was
Mm.
taught without life.
Amen.
It,
Yeah.
it was dates and names and boring and oh my gosh, there was some big conference. Oh gosh, when's lunch? All right. So nobody ever, I mean, okay, the teachers probably tried to explain. I was too hard headed. What is habeas corpus? Why does this matter? No,
Mhm.
nobody, it was just, oh, Lincoln suspended this, had to be done. Right.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of it. And it's something, especially for parents out there with, younger kids. And by younger, I mean high school and younger and grandkids. One thing I try really hard to do to when I talk about history, whether it be history or more modern history, like if one of my kids asked me about the housing crisis, or you
Mhm.
get talking about that, I really try to bring the life into it,
Yes.
right? Because that's history, and that's what really gives people interest in it
Mhm.
versus just memorizing dates for a test, which I think is a cheap way out for teachers because it's true or false, right?
Mhm.
So something to consider as you guys are doing that. All right, so I'll take my union hat off here,
Thank
and
God. Now I get to look at that beautiful hair.
I'm
Thank
telling you,
God.
extra time
Woo.
just for you this morning, brother.
Jesus.
But so this is my perspective growing up as a northerner, and I could never really wrap my arms around what's the big deal,
Mm.
right? 100
Mhm.
and what 150 years ago, right?
Mm.
Ish.
Give or take.
Yeah. So um I, I've really struggled over the years, like I'm a NASCAR fan. Okay.
Mhm.
And even all the way up through 1971, and researching for the show, I found this that Buddy Baker won the Southern 500 at Darlington, and he's standing there in victory lane with the car holding the trophy, and there's a gentleman dressed as a Confederate soldier standing on the hood of the car holding the Confederate battle flag.
Mhm.
And I looked at that yesterday and went, huh, well, that would not go over well today.
No.
um so it's that um that and I admit it's perception. I mean, and you know Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, the places where I grew up and now live, there wasn't a single battle in those states. And maybe Southern Illinois, there were a few. Okay.
You know how many battles were fought in Tennessee?
Oh my gosh, I have
Take a
no idea.
guess. Take a
Oh
wild
gosh, I
guess.
would I would say 1,000.
Over 400.
Okay. All All right. I wasn't
just in
sure.
Tennessee.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what really. I mean, if a little skirmish or how it was
Yeah,
counted. So,
yeah.
um, but I for sure never touched Wisconsin or Iowa.
Mhm.
But as a interesting side note on that, Wisconsin did have Arthur MacArthur down at Chickamauga and over at Missionary Hill there as well. From Wisconsin, won the Congressional Medal of Honor, and his I believe is his grandson, a guy you may have heard of, Douglas MacArthur.
Mhm. He won the Medal of
So
Honor
yes, he did.
at was it Gettysburg?
Arthur MacArthur.
Yeah,
It was
or
Chickamauga's.
Chickamauga. Okay,
It was
Chickamauga.
actually on Missionary Hill, which wasn't actually Chickamauga, but the battle afterwards that
Lookout Mountain.
broke the Confederacy. Yeah. No,
Okay,
Missionary Hill is to the east, just to
okay.
the east of Lookout Mountain there.
Look at what
Um,
Craig says. God, this is so important for Americans to understand this
okay,
comment here.
well, let's get a look here. Hey, yes, absolutely true. Great point, Craig. 150 years ago is modern history in the UK. And, to that point as well, and I never thought about it in quite this way, but especially when the Iraq War kicked off, I remember reading reports of there was a mural of Saddam Hussein, and his face had been altered to sort of resemble somebody from I'm making this part up, the 1600s or the
Mm,
1500s or whatever it was. And the people there recognized that,
mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm,
And it goes to that, well, why not get over it?
mm-hmm.
Right. Now, here's the other thing, too. I will say it's really easy to say get over it when, quote unquote, my side is the North one,
Mm.
right?
Yeah, it didn't impact you guys like it
Hey,
did down
hey,
here.
hey, Germans, get over it. Hey,
Mm-hmm,
Japanese, get over it. Right. And looking back on it now, I can see how smug that attitude was, right?
mm-hmm.
Because it's really easy to say that when you win.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter whether that's a business dealing or a war or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. We got see Eric is on. Good morning, Eric. He says, "Good morning, folks. Hope everyone is enjoying the holidays." Yeah, likewise. We're going to try to keep the show kid friendly because I want you to be able to share this with your children. And if you're driving them to school, maybe they can listen in. And I want to reshape how you think about some of these things. And some of these things are going to be, we're going to shine the bright light of the 21st century on them. And then some things I'm going to try to help you see it in the light in which they saw it.
All right.
Um,
Awesome.
I guess we're
I,
ready.
yeah, let's take a look at well, let's Joseph, I see your comment there. Let's wait till the end in the aftermath. We're going to come
Yeah.
back to that one. Yeah,
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
the stuff. It's a great point, and I think is worth spending a little time on later on.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll come back to it, but just for those that are listening, I want you to. This is a great primer. Joseph says, "I'm going there. If Lincoln was a Republican, why are only 12% of Black Americans Republican? Only 25% own firearms today. Being Black myself, the Constitution and its amendments are my second Bible." Amen, Joseph. And as Will said, we will come back and chew on that later. Will says, living in Montana, 7 sovereign nations live within the disliked remains of today. So we're going to examine the cause. And right out of the gate, the North looked at this as the War of Rebellion, whereas the South called the war. This is during the war. Like now we say, oh, the Civil War, but they didn't call it that then necessarily. By the end of the war, that name became in vogue by 1850. But really, throughout the first 4 years of the war, it was called the War of the Rebellion in the North and the War of Southern Independence in the South. Johnny King is on from Kentucky. Will Hollenbeck is on. Good morning. Please like and then quickly hit that share button. Fair use copyright. I don't own images that are going to be displayed today. We're going to make this PDF downloadable for you guys when it becomes a podcast. So stay tuned for that. If you want to download that, you'll be free to do so. But let's start out with why study the American Civil War. As Will said, it's a long time ago, guys. My goodness, it's several generations ago, maybe 5 generations ago. Who gives a crap? Well, they're multifaceted, but if I was to give you 3 reasons you should study the Civil War, because number one, the causes and consequences of division. Is the nation divided today, Will?
Yes, and
Okay.
getting worse.
And getting worse. So this is kind of the Civil War provides an insight into the underlying social, economic, and political factors that led to an armed conflict that killed over 600,000 American troops on both sides, and probably upwards to a million Americans in total. The second reason why I'd say you need to study the Civil War more than you just got in high school or college, because the lessons of leadership and governance. The Civil War provides an excellent example for how to lead, the challenges that these people were facing during a crisis, the decisions that they made, such as Abraham Lincoln or Jeff Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, as well as their military commanders, teach us and can teach us how what governance looks like, diplomacy looks like, crisis management, maybe the failures of those things of governance, diplomacy, and crisis management. And
Mhm.
lastly, I would say it's the cultural legacy and how that cultural legacy shapes our national and regional identities. I love the fact that Will is and has always been a Northerner, and I have always been a Southerner. My children are eighth generation East Tennesseans, and that has a meaning to us here. We can't and won't ever get over it. You know why? Because invading Union armies, I'm thinking of Sherman specifically, cut a 60-mile wide swath of destruction. Everything in his path for 60 miles across was burned and destroyed, and any person in that. And we'll probably need to do one about Sherman's March to the Sea, because the more I read about it, it's absolutely horrific. But anyway,
If I can
of
interject there for just a second, Rich, and maybe this is
course,
a northern or southern thing, or maybe this is just where I was brought up at, or my family. We don't talk about generational stuff in the North like Southerners do. I think that's
mm,
an important distinction. It just isn't. I never hear anybody from the North saying I'm an eighth generation Illinoisan. Well,
mm,
first, who would want to admit that in today's world? Um,
mhm.
but I think that's an important distinction too. Is I feel like the people from the South are more connected to that culture, that area, like you are.
Yeah,
I don't feel that at all up here.
that's and I know my not stepson, son-in-law, John Weismuller. His family came over from what is now Romania. At the time, it was Hungary. They were German colonists in the Hungarian Empire at the time. But his great grandfather came over, and he doesn't know his name, doesn't know, or I'm starting to make him care about it. But and then he married a Russian woman when he got to America, and his mother's family were Polish immigrants. Doesn't mean anything to him.
Mhm,
Whereas in my house yesterday over breakfast, my father was talking about how much his great grandfather George Washington Brown, who was born in the 1870s, loved biscuits and gravy.
mhm,
These people are alive and well, and they cast shadows in my house every
mhm.
single day,
Yep.
going all the way back to, my grandfather would talk about his great grandfather who was born in the 1850s as if the dude was still alive. So that's an incredible distinction that I think it's interesting to know that the North doesn't look at things like that. Finally, I would say that the Civil War serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of democracy and the ongoing necessity to address divisions constructively, underscoring the urgency and importance of the topic itself. What about that?
Yeah, you couldn't hit that any more on the head if you tried even harder. Because we're going to talk more about that at the end of today's show, guys. And I don't think people really understand how fragile this is, and in my opinion, how close we are to breaking it. And I don't mean this election cycle. I'm talking more in that historical perspective of let's measure this in 10, 15 years, which is a very short time in history, I understand.
Very
But I
short.
think it's because we're so close to that possibility.
Yeah. I hope you can appreciate why we need to talk about this, and not like, oh my God, Richard was going to give us a history lesson. Not so much. I love Ted's point. He's a Mississippian. He says the last Civil War pension ended in 2020 in Mississippi. That's that's insanely recent. I remember reading about that.
Mhm,
What happened was, and I'll go ahead and give us the screen here. And Ted may know this, or you guys may or may not know this. I remember reading about there were two women that were still alive in the 20 teens who were married to Confederate men, or
mhm,
a Union man and a Confederate man. The woman who was married to a Union man was living in Blaine, Tennessee, not far from where I am sitting right now. And the way it worked is she had some issues. One leg was shorter than the other one. One hand was malformed, and the family didn't think she would ever have a prospect for a husband or be able to work for herself. So you know what they did? They took this young girl, I think she was 16 or 17, and married her to an 80-something-year-old Union veteran. And the idea was that she would be able to collect his pension for the rest of her life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what she did. And you know what's interesting about that is you would, today with our moral standards, we would go, my God, that's the sickest thing I've ever heard. But when she was interviewed, she said, I never remarried. That was the greatest love of my life.
Yeah.
And she lived alone for the rest of her life. And she said, he treated me with kindness and compassion that I didn't even know could be afforded to another human being. It's tear-jerking story. And the person that Ted Leonard is talking about, the Sons of the Confederacy, like literally round the clock, took care of this woman until she passed away. So this should be alive and well for all of us. And if we don't, we're doomed to repeat it.
Well, and to that point as well, just because and I'm certainly not advocating for this as a father of a daughter, an arranged marriage doesn't mean it's that you necessarily can't have two good people come together. The other thing too is that we have to look at the times, that perspective. If a lady didn't marry back then, it was not going to be an easy life. So, so for her to say that was the best thing that ever happened to me, she was provided for. Now, by modern, and again, this is that perspective over history. By modern standards, we're like, oh, wow, you could have accommodations. Well, there weren't back then.
Yeah.
So
just to speak to this, my Memo Collins, I have vague memories of her. She passed away as an old woman, like in 1971, 72. But she talks about how when she was a little girl in the mountains of North Georgia, this guy came down the road and stopped by the split rail fence and offered her dad, I'll bring a hog down here if you let me have that little one there, and traded a hog for her when she was like 13 years old. And she was married to that guy for the rest of her life. And this is living memory, man.
Yeah.
So Johnny King says, if the Rikers Island rumor is true, then I'd say we are going to war. And
I think that's another one to circle back to as we get to the modern perspective here. I'll make a note here.
So modern perspective, when you see these I'm glad somebody's colorizing these photographs of the Civil War, because I offer this to you to think differently about it. Don't think of these people as just some shadowy image. Let them cast a shadow. Let them walk around your room. Think about the people in this photograph here. And I love the fact that, and I just happened to find these on the internet and try to put them together. But it's ironic that the woman is wearing some sort of maroon in both pictures, the modern picture of the wife, and then the children are dressed in blue like their father. And that's the exact same thing. And so here you have what we would consider a Union officer in modern day. He's a U.S. Army officer, and over here you have a Confederate Army officer. So these men could face each other on the battlefield today. And then lastly is the horrors of the war are just the same today as it was. Here I have a photograph of a Union soldier lying dead at Cold Harbor, Virginia in 1864. And then I have a GI who's in his death throes in Vietnam, and they looked identical. They could be brothers. So think of the horrors of this, and don't just think of like your teachers told you on the 8th day of February, this happened. And who gives a crap?
Right.
What's the plot of the story? And that's why today, the causes I'm going to give you, I don't see them anywhere listed kind of in chronological order, but I put them in chronological order the way I think the most important topics are. So anyway, let's get into it. The causes, chronological order. I'm going to go into each one. No need to read over these, but I will tell you the ones with a red asterisk are the ones that I don't see other historians saying are important, but I think are incredibly important. And let's get into it. The first one is the sectional, cultural, and economic differences that were at present from the very founding of this country, going back to the 1605 Jamestown till 1860 when the shooting started. And it really has to do with what regions of the British Isles that our ancestors came from. For those of us that, these are the people that were the power brokers at the time in America, and they came from places like the ones that ended up in Virginia and the lowland South. They were royalists coming from the UK. Well, back then it would just be Britain, I would imagine, but New England, the Puritans came from a certain point, and they had regional differences then, and they had regional differences until the start of the war. And in some way, the regional differences are alive and well today. It's interesting if you go back and look, Will, the who's who of American men prior to the 1860s. The Northerners were bankers, lawyers, writers. Those are the academics. Those are the things that got them into the book. Whereas the Southern men that were in the who's who of American people, they were military officers or war heroes. And I think that martial culture is still alive and well, specifically here in the volunteer state, which each and every year gives more than its fair share to the military. The growing divide fostered regional loyalty over national loyalty. And the Northern Society had a larger urban population. About 25% lived in cities, whereas in the South, about 10%. And then you had, as I've just alluded to, Southern society was much more patriarchal, hierarchical, agrarian, and rigid, with wealthy plantation owners really making up most of the political power in the South. And social status was tied to land ownership. If you didn't own land, you weren't much of a man. And that philosophy is still much in play here in the South. There was a growing anti-slavery movement in the North that led to abolition societies, and the conversation moving that way. Now, the abolition movement really kind of peaks around the 1830s and slowly kind of drops down, which is not something I would have thought about before researching. I would have thought it would kind of continue to go, but that's not necessarily the case. But I think the Dred Scott decision brings it back up for discussion, and we'll get there in due course.
Okay.
Last thing is, this is a multivariable problem, the Civil War. It's not one thing. It's not 10 things. I'm making it sound like it's 10 things, but in reality, it's not. And I'm going to give a couple of different things as we go on. Like if I was to do this slideshow again, I probably would have condensed one and added technology, but we'll get to that. Another thing, when you think about slavery, slavery in the South was more along the lines of property. I think a wealthy plantation owner that owned a lot of slaves, he could twist the context of it and go, it's really about property, guys. So if you're a Southerner that don't have a slave, but you own property, and he's going to say, in his political message is going to be, they're wanting to take your property.
Yep.
And let's take your land.
Right. And let me dive into that for a second, because there is a perspective there back to the founding fathers. And this is one of the things that I don't think gets a fair amount of time in a lot of discussions about the Civil War. The founding fathers were between a rock and a hard place when it came to slavery. And what I mean there is there would not have ever been a United States of America if the founding fathers had not made some compromises.
Yep.
And
talk about that.
The life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness was originally, as I'm sure you're aware, Rich, life, liberty, and property.
That's right.
And slaves were considered property at the time. And they changed that, but they did not abolish slavery in the Constitution because they knew without that, they could not get the Southern states to sign on to the Constitution. So that is one of the many compromises that were made by the founding fathers to bring the states together to create the United States of America, but also create a framework for the eventual abolishment of slavery.
And let me get it out of the way. Slavery is a immoral evil. It's a stain on our national character. And I don't mean just the Southern national. I'm talking about the entire nation, because our founders were slaveholders.
Yes.
And, it's written into the Constitution. And in the South, it was codified because it's in the Bible. And we being Southerners, we had let the slaves go to church. Absolutely. We'll bring them. If you had a big enough plantation, you had a little church there for your slaves to go to church, because the Bible says, take care of your master. It's in there a lot. There's really nothing in there. And then you would have some of the bigger churches. For one, it was really discouraged, if not completely illegal, for a slave to give the sermon. And we learned why, because of Nat Turner. He was kind of a preacher. And how did that work out? He killed like 60 something men, women, and white men, women, and children. So don't want to do that. But a lot of the white preachers would allow a slave, one of the deacons, to come up and say a prayer, and that prayer might go on for 10 minutes. And that was the slave's way to give a sermon to his fellow enslaved people. So the founders were slaveholders. The Constitution, the Bible, Northern factories, as much as the North wants to, look down their nose at the Southern, they were beneficiaries of the slavery system. You know why? Because all that cotton went up to the Northern textile mills. Yes. And they knew that who the hell was picking that cotton. The other thing is, we were so close to each other, we Southern men and women, and the slaves that lived in our homes and lived in our amongst our families, that 13% of Southerners still have sub-Saharan African DNA, and I'm one of them. So I have, a percentage of my DNA is from I think it's Nigeria.
Okay.
And it didn't get in there by accident. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So
yeah.
But when you start talking about my property, oh my God, my property. So forget slavery for us. The how we look at it in the 21st century, the evil that it was. Got that.
Yep.
But when you start attacking my property, you're attacking my honor, my values, my personal sense of personal autonomy, the history of the founders of this nation, and everything. So think about that for a second. So there's differences. Now, this is an interesting map because, as I just showed you, let's go back real quick. And I apologize if you're listening to this later, but you can see these waves of migration coming out of different parts of the, what now is the UK. But if you fast forward this was done in 2017. Well, they took genomic data from 770,000 Americans and analyzed it. And look what they found. Those patterns of migration, they're still here.
Yep,
it's
for
insane.
Sure.
So we think that this is, oh man, this is over. No, it's not. The Scots-Irish people, Dr. Cohen up in Michigan did a study, and he found that Southerners with Scots-Irish ancestry are physiologically deal with aggression different. I mean, at the genetic level, we're different than other people because of the culture of honor went on for so long. We can talk about that perhaps on another show, but I love this quote here. This is from Dr. Ramsey, who was a contemporary historian writing in Knoxville in 1858. And he wrote, "I conceal from no one my deep conviction that the days of our present union are nearly numbered. Our people will never again be a unit. The high-toned New England spirit has denigrated into a clannish feeling of profound Yankeeism. The masses of the North are venal, corrupt, covetous, mean, and selfish. We are essentially two people." And I like that because it doesn't, slavery isn't in there. Dr. Ramsey didn't own slaves. It ain't about slaves. He's in East Tennessee, and slavery was relatively uncommon here in the East Tennessee. But he feels that what's going on in the North, the way they're living their lives, is disgusting. It's corrupt. It's morally bankrupt. And I think a lot of us, Republicans specifically, but Southerners in generally, kind of feel the same way about what's going on right now, whether it's in California or Chicago or New York. What do you think?
You know what? I'm glad you mentioned those areas. I want to try something here. Okay. I'm doing this off the cuff, guys. Can you bring that back up for me, brother?
Yeah, man. Let's do it.
I'm going to change the middle part of that. The high-toned city folk spirit has denigrated into wokeism, feeling a profound moral high ground. The masses of the cities are venal, corrupt, covetous, mean, and selfish. We're essentially two people. Urban versus rural today.
Absolutely. And he's writing it in the moment. And what's interesting about this, when Dr. Ramsey was writing this, was a guy named Yancey out of Alabama, and he had spent years up in the North, and he comes down to the South, kind of doing a lecture tour, talking about the evils that he saw. Slavery ain't a part of it. He's just talking about, let me tell you the way they live up there. And the people in the South are like, what? I don't want anything to do with these people. And Craig, I'm sorry, Johnny King brings up an excellent point here. Says there are still communities in rural Kentucky that are still racially divided due to land ownership from that era. I'm going to take you all the way back to the Cretaceous period, and we're going to work our way forward on something that's going to maybe blow your mind, maybe not.
Okay.
Maybe you guys are smarter than I am, but states' rights. The second thing, influenced by Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, the idea that the government derives its power from the consent of the governed supports the notion that states had certain rights and powers. This was particularly relevant in the context of slaves forming a union and the ability to withdraw from that union. And of course, the Constitutional Convention in 1787 gave us the 10th Amendment, which reserves the powers not granted to it by the federal government to the states or the people. So that was a big thing for Confederate right.
And the that, how do I put this? That furthering of power concentrated in the at the federal level versus states is ongoing, as we know, and has been codified with a Supreme Court decision regarding wheat interstate um, commerce with wheat in the 1920s was the big changeover. So this has been an ongoing thing. Power wants more power.
Yeah, absolutely. So states' rights is an important one. And I put up here I knew this guy existed, but I thought it was just something they called him. I thought it was like a nickname, General States' Rights Gist. It's not. It was actually what his parents gave him that name in 1831. And we'll see why 1831 was a pivotal time. So that was his birth name, States' Rights. He went by states. He was killed at the Battle of Franklin. His last words were, "Take me to my wife," which is heartbreaking. He went to Harvard Law School. And that's another thing people forget. These people were as modern as we are. They went to schools that we would recognize today. They thought in a lot of ways like we did. And in some ways, it was completely anathema to how we think today. This is one of those things. So it's got a red asterisk by it because you don't hear a lot of historians say that this is one of the primary causes of the Civil War, but I think it was the abolishment of the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade specifically, definitely was a causal factor because this is an interesting thing here. Only 6% of the enslaved Africans coming out of Africa went to the United States. Only 6%. So 94% of them went to the Caribbean or South America or maybe somewhere else in the world, but only 6% came here. And yet by 1860, we had the largest enslaved population in the world.
Can I give you a little insight on that one?
Yeah, man.
Based on the tour, one of the tours we did in Franklin, it was it escapes me, Carrington House, I believe it was. If anybody's gonna go there, we had a tour of the farm, and I learned there's a difference between a farm and a plantation. A plantation only grows one crop, a farm grows many. So this was technically a farm. But the tour was given by the genealogist, and the tour was entirely given from the slave perspective, which was incredibly interesting. But to your point, the country with what modern day country with the largest slave population was Brazil. And part of the reason their number declined over time is they were hacking away at the jungles down there, and the slaves became part of the food chain for the animals. And even though we imported fewer slaves than Brazil, over time through procreation, we got more and more slaves. So I thought that was an interesting tidbit that ties into what you're talking about with the 6% number here. So again, a perspective that I never learned as a Northerner. I would have, if you would have asked me a number of years ago, I would have been like 95% came to the U.S. So
yeah,
just to try and tie in those 2%, the perception and the reality.
No, that's a great point, man. And one of the reasons why we end up by 1860 having the largest amount of enslaved people is because, as you alluded to, sugarcane being what it was, it paid to just work people to death. I mean, and I don't need women down here for sugarcane. I need a man who could swing a machete, kind of thing. You see what I'm saying? So,
Yep.
whereas we took women on board as well, female slaves, and now when the Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 of the Constitution talks about prohibiting the federal government from limiting the importation of persons, which would be enslaved African persons. Of course, that's the way they were saying it. They just didn't come out right out and say it. Must exist in the states that see fit to allow it for 20 years after the Constitution takes in effect. So in 1870, 20 years later, just like clockwork, slavery is banned as of January 1, 1880, signed by President Jefferson, ironically, who was a large slaveholder.
Mm-hmm.
And this had a profound effect because you can no longer allow, we can no longer anticipate getting new slaves from Africa. So you better take care of the ones you got.
Mm-hmm.
And the price of the slaves that you had and the importance of them and just skyrockets. So it's a very important thing to understand. There was an economic incentive to not work your slave to death. That was done in South America, but to have them in families. And although the families were not legally recognized, and to have them reproduce, the more, the better. So does that make sense?
It does, yes. And I'm going to throw the disclaimer in there again. This is, and I know I'm speaking for you on this one. No justification here, guys. It was just the way it was at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was.
And of course, we look back on it now and go, that's terrible. And it was terrible, but that's what it was at the time. The same way people will look back on us in 150 years from now and talk about the terrible things that are we see as normal.
And if you went back to 1850s, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and you think, well, you just didn't see slaves unless you were on one of these plantations. That's not true, man. Anywhere in the travel industry, from the porter to the wherever, to people working in factories, you had slaves working in factories alongside of, incoming immigrants, the Irish and other folks that needed a wage. So they're in there, they're building locomotives, they're building ships, and then they come home at the end of the week and they hand over their paycheck to their owner.
Yes.
Another
and that
thing
was brought up during these tours as well. And again, from a northern perspective, and the education in the North, I would have told you, nope, there's a hard line in there somewhere.
Yep.
That was actually something I did not learn until we were on that trip last month.
So you imagine if you owned, let's say, one female slave, you buy a female slave, let's say back then it cost you what it cost you, roughly, anywhere, it would cost you like a inexpensive car, say 25,000 ish in today's dollars to buy a female. What's interesting now is you send her to work, and maybe she's a waitress or a waiter somewhere, or she's working somewhere in the travel industry in the city. She comes home every night. Maybe she does a little work around the house, and then in the week you get her paycheck that you get to keep. And maybe you're even renting her out to somebody else.
Yes.
Maybe you don't have any use for her there in East Tennessee, but you rent her out to somebody, and then you get paid a monthly payment, and then you get to keep the children and you sell them too. I mean, it is a wicked, wicked, awful economic system, but it existed. I'm not going to go into the compromises because most of them you heard already when you were in school, and they are as boring and nuanced as anything. What I will tell you is there were several. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Wilmot Proviso of 1846, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. If you want to download the thing, you can read it yourself. These were just politicians struggling over how do we handle this sleeping serpent that the Constitution left under the table when it was signed.
And so the more things change, the more they stay the same, because politicians are trying to find a way to handle this without coming out and just taking care of the problem, right? So they're trying to, I'm sure each state has its own base, right? The same now as the rural versus urban. So that's one thing that my family and I kept saying more and more and more. My wife and I, just because we're older and have more experience and more perspective, we said it over and over on that Civil War trip. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah. And so, the war with Mexico creates a lot of these problems because it brings in a lot more states. And as you alluded to earlier, then now the idea is, what do we do? What are we going to allow slavery in these states? And if we do, that's going to offset the balance of power.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the compromises was the Fugitive Slave Act. Hey, look, man, if some enslaved person gets up here, the enslavers are more than welcome to come anywhere they need to in the territories and bring them back.
Yeah.
This was one of those sick compromises that they did to try to hold the peace together.
And my understanding is that really solidified the feelings of the North towards the Civil War, because now you've got people coming up and hunting people.
Yes.
Right. And
And guess
now
who was
you can't look the other way.
right? Yeah, they're stomping around in your area at
Mm-hmm.
leisure.
Yeah.
And they're unscrupulous. It's like because think about it, they didn't have ID cards. It's like I'm looking for a guy by the name of Buck. One of the sad ones I read about was this guy says, I'm looking for my runaway slave, Jim. And
Mm-hmm.
Jim is probably on his way to Savannah because that's where I sold his wife and kids off to in Savannah. And it's like, oh my God,
Yeah.
think about that.
Yeah.
If they sold your wife and your beautiful children off and to
Mm-hmm.
Indiana, you think I'm gonna be able to restrain you to
Yeah.
Wisconsin?
Yeah.
Hell
Good
no.
luck. Yeah.
Yeah, good luck, brother.
And I'll to your point about that, reading this horrible story, I started listening to a audiobook on Nathan Bedford Forrest, and I'm
Mhm.
not squeamish, guys. Um, I had to stop it a couple times when they were talking about this stuff because it's just horrendous, terrible stuff. And in my opinion, that's what needs to be taught more of, age appropriate, especially at a college level, because it was just, you think about these families torn apart like you just described. That's the historical perspective we need so we can identify it when it happens again, because eventually it will happen again in one way or another in the world.
Well, I think there are some things at play right now I won't go into because it's out of context, but I think there are some immoral things at play right now that are alive and well in the North and in certain blue areas that I think are morally wrong and may lead to shooting at some point. Number 5, Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act of 18, this is another one of those red asterisks which you don't really hear historians talk about as one of the causes, but I'm going to tell you it is, because when the Indians were forced out of their ancestral areas and forced to relocate, they were leaving um, really rich land. This is, again, I said ancestral land. You know why? Because they
Right.
picked the best places to live,
Of course.
fertile soil, great waterways, etc. So as the outflow of Native Americans are moved out of their territories in the deep South, it exposed all this fertile ground for cotton crops. And see, Virginia, by planting tobacco is really hard on soil. So for years, for decades, centuries perhaps, they had been growing tobacco and other crops, which had really just destroyed the soil, which left it only good for wheat. Whereas as cotton becomes more profitable, starting around 1800, and we'll talk about why, you see uh, the the Virginia planter class moving into these areas where the Native Americans had once lived. Now, why is cotton now the thing? Because the cotton gin in
Mhm.
1794. So it literally doubles the output of cotton. And you see this every decade from 1800 until 1860, doubling every single year. And cotton of the South made up 75% of the world's cotton.
So, in other
Um,
words, technology changed how things were being done, increased productivity, and we could even tie that, and we could even call that the AI of the time.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought up technology because that would be one of the things that I said if I could do something, I would probably merge two and then add in technology because a lot of stuff is going on. As the cotton gin, we just talked about that, but also you had interchangeable parts.
Mhm.
Craig is on from the UK. The British kept hearing about interchangeable parts, couldn't really wrap their head around it. So there was a European delegation made up of French and British and some other European nations. They came over to one of our manufacturing plants. This is pre-Civil War, I think 1840-ish. And they take them to a Springfield arms manufacturing facility. And like, okay, this is a Springfield from 1830 all the way up to today. and there's 10 of them from different production lines, different time periods. They take them apart and say, hey, put them together. And the Europeans could not believe that the parts all worked the same screws, because before then, they were not mass producible. This is something that a local artisan had to do, and it just blew their mind. So you have cotton gin, interchangeable parts.
If I can go back to that for just a second, think about how, okay, so it blew their minds then. Think about how obvious that sounds now to have interchangeable parts. We can go on, pick your website and go, hey, I need some roll pins for an AR, or I need, a screw to hold my red dot mount onto my pistol. And we don't think anything of that. But at the time, that was revolutionary technology. Same thing with the cotton gin. So again, the more things change, the more they stay the same. We just change what that technology is. And humans haven't changed throughout all this. Greed, envy, love, lust, it's all there. And that's why I think it's why it's valuable to talk about this and learn this, because technology is technology and people are people. And it's still the same way today.
Yeah. So we talked about interchangeable parts relative to weapons, but rifled barrels, right? The Revolutionary War were fought with smoothbore muskets, which meant that, if I'm 100 yards probably from my barn, if I shot a smoothbore musket at it, a good luck hitting anything, right? I mean, you might literally hit the broadside of a barn. Whereas a rifled barrel, and these rifle barrels that were used in the Civil War, they're shooting a caliber, 50 caliber or in excess of that, 1,000 yards with pinpoint accuracy. So all those tactics hadn't caught up with the fact that you can now shoot a man in the forehead from, hundreds of yards away.
Yes.
The telegraph. Oh my God. The telegraph, the modern day internet, right? Another thing the telegraph did, the southern states could now cooperate a lot faster. You could also, like, as far as, every Monday morning you come on here, Will, and you give us the local financial news. Well, now I can trade cotton like that. I can trade all these southern commodities very rapidly with the use of the telegraph. Canals, railroads, all this stuff was light years ahead of what had been before. And it changed America in a lot of amazing ways. The railroad specifically, as we'll get into here in just a second.
And if I can jump in there just a second, I ran across one yesterday. There was a rifle the Confederacy had, a scoped rifle, as a matter of fact. They were getting hits out to 2,000 yards with that rifle. Right. And one of the things I learned in Chickamauga.
And who were they killing with that?
Officers, number one, and artillerymen. Because the artillery would sit back and lob artillery in, just same as today. So nothing really changes. But especially at Chickamauga, so the number of horses it took to move this stuff was astounding. I won't dig into the numbers because we're already an hour into this. But from a long ways away, it was without that specialized rifle, it was very difficult to hit the artillerymen. But just behind them were their horses. So they would target the horses so that they couldn't move the artillery as the battle progressed.
Amen.
So now you look at that, you're talking about transportation and technology. Well, how is that any different now than, an attack on a telegraph line back then and attack on the power grid now?
Yeah, it's not.
Yep.
Final thing I'd say about the Indian Removal Act, because it's so tied to cotton, because as I'm going to show you some maps here in just a second, once they leave these areas and they're so fertile, and you got the cotton gin making cotton growing so profitable, that it increases the demand for slaves and land. Let's take a look at where these areas are. So the Indian removal, you can see parts of northern Mississippi, I believe where Ted is from, parts of northern Georgia, northern Alabama. Again, these were the prime real estate. And here you can see southern cotton production in 1820. So prior to the removal, they're not growing in those Indian lands. Look at what happens by 1860. And I want you to really zero in on this crescent-shaped area of Alabama, kind of mid-Alabama there. This is important because look at this. The map on the left,
Oh,
sh-
wow.
yeah, the map on the left shows an ancient seabed where the back then the ocean came up right to that edge, and when the ocean receded, it left all this fertile area, limestone area,
Mhm.
etc. This is 100 to 66 million years ago. We call this the black belt now of the South, which is the cotton belt of old. And this is voting trends from, I believe, 2018.
Okay.
And you could see the Democratic vote right along that same crustacean period from 100 million years ago.
Wow.
So the legacy of this is with us, whether we like to think we're enlightened and we're beyond it. We're not.
No, we're the same
Before,
animals we were then.
yeah. Let's see
Yeah.
here. Joseph says, I'm related to a slave woman who was one of 6 female slaves owned by a man from Scotland who purchased a small farm in 1830s North Carolina. He never paid for a male slave. No, he
Hmm.
didn't. You know why? Because he had these women.
Yeah.
If you haven't read, and I encourage everybody to read Up from Slavery by Booker T. Washington. Read Frederick Douglass's book. If you could only read one, read that. Read Slaves in the Family. There are some amazing slave narratives out there, and I encourage you to read all of them. If you can only read one, read Frederick Douglass's book. It's absolutely outstanding, incredible book. Just the parts about where he learns to read and what reading meant to someone who had never had the ability to understand what those squiggly lines on a page were, and how they could transport you to another place. And he's like, I'm reading about the Greeks for the first time, and like, there's this whole world out there that exists that I don't even know about.
Yeah.
And it gives me chills to this day to even think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then he talks about how there was this one woman on a plantation nearby, and she had given birth to like so many children, and they had so many grandchildren, great grandchildren, and like in excess of, I think, 60 something human beings could come from this one woman. And now she's too old to work and this and that. And they build her a house, the white family that enslaved her. They built her a house and put her on it and provided her food and kind of took care of her. And he said, but she had no one. Those
Mm-hmm.
children she had given birth to were all sold off, and she's unsellable now. And he goes,
Mm-hmm.
and the white Northerners think, oh, look how she was cared for by these Southern enslavers. It's like, no, she should have had her family around her in her later
Mm-hmm.
years. She was deprived of
Yeah.
that. Uh,
Yeah.
so again, please read the slave narratives. Number 6, the nullification crisis. Again, this is one of those that the historians say had nothing to do with it. I'm going to tell you, it does, and briefly why you need to understand this.
Okay.
Because President Andrew Jackson, a Southerner, Scots Irishman, like myself, born in South Carolina, he introduces the tariff of 1828. And it's going to impose a 50% tariff on goods coming in from the British Isles. Okay. And now, why is he doing this? Because he wants to protect Northern industry and make the South buy Northern goods. Well, this pisses
Mm-hmm.
off the Southerners. Why? Because they were getting goods. You might think in today's mind that uh, moving goods across the ocean must have been insanely expensive. And it was expensive, but the cost of moving something from the UK all the way across the Atlantic Ocean on a sailing ship to the coast cost a certain dollar amount. To take that same good 30 miles inland in the southern states costs the same amount. The
Yeah.
moving goods before rails was insanely expensive.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about flat bottom boats. You're talking about a horse and buggy, a trip from Cincinnati prior to the railroads coming in, a trip from Cincinnati to New York, which today we would do in a few hours, took 7 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
mean, these are insane things. So, what does South Carolina do? Well, South Carolina says, we're going to null and void it.
Mm-hmm.
We don't agree with it, and therefore our right as a state says that we can nullify this and deem them unconstitutional. President Jackson says,
Well, can I
yes,
stop you there for just a second, brother? Because
please, absolutely.
that one, let's talk about the Second Amendment, near and dear to all of our hearts here, right?
Hmm.
Well, there was when a lot of gun control is being talked about under Obama, there were a lot of states saying we're just not going to enforce it.
Mm-hmm.
So the more things stay, more things change, the more they stay the same, right? And that's
Yeah.
one from the political right, not the political left. And of course, the Roe v. Wade being overturned, we see how that kicked it back to the states for sure. But now we're seeing with that the left wants that centralized power, right? They don't want to
Yeah.
have the states be able to have their own thing. So sorry to interrupt, but
No.
I think it's
Again,
important to bring back together to today's world. It's still the same stuff.
it is still the same stuff, and you're absolutely right. So they try to nullify it, say we're not going to do it, not going to pay the tariff, kiss my ass, and we'll oppose you by force if we have to. I bring this up because this is the first time that a state is saying, I'm ready to go to war over this tariff. They're not saying they're going to go to war over slavery or anything to do with it. They're ready to secede because of a tax. And the precedent is already there because we did the same thing via the Stamp Act. England imposes a Stamp Act on the colonies, a 2% tax, and we go to war and get our own country. South Carolina says 50%, kiss my ass. I'm ready to go to war over it. And Andrew Jackson goes to Congress and he gets basically like a War Powers Act and says, I'll come down there and make you pay it. Andrew Jackson, his point here is interesting because he says that the Constitution formed a government representing and acting on behalf of the people. It's not a league of states, basically. So I won't go into all the background changes that highlighted this crisis, but understand that at the time of this came along, there was only 13 miles of railroad at the time. And they were in the north. By 1860, there's 13,000 miles of rail. And you might think, well, damn, that's a lot. But 75% of it was in the north. How convenient for the north.
Yeah.
The same thing. The canals were constructed in the north.
Yeah. To beat that drum again, technology.
Yes.
That's the AI of the time.
Yes. And here's another thing. So, and again, the North, I think, looking down their nose on Southern slavery. Well, guess what? 1.6 million Irish immigrants came to the United States at the time, and 7/8 or roughly 90% of them went to Union cities and were worked for basic slave wages, and starvation was rampant. So much so that the death rate from starvation in New York City was twice of that as London. And we all know, Craig can tell us how bad London was in the early 1800s. Well, that was nothing compared to New York because they just worked these immigrants to death in those factories. So, which is another thing, and I'll briefly touch on this. This is a complete change in the way America used to be. In your small town, you basically knew everybody. You went to church with everybody. Very small unit. You had one cobbler to build and mend your shoes. You had a blacksmith, and he was training his sons to do the same job. You had the local guy that ground your wheat to make flour. And these were local artisans. And if they wanted to take a day off, they took a day off. Now, wage labor comes along. And in the South, this is really frowned upon. This is wage slavery is what they called it. You know, you're working for a man who can fire you at will from this factory just because he doesn't think you're producing enough. And it just tore apart the artisan class, and it's an upheaval. So all this is kind of going on in the background during the nullification crisis. So I could go all day, but let's just say it was bad. Number 7, Uncle Tom's Cabin. We probably all are familiar with Harriet Beecher Stowe's amazing novel that really changed the discourse of the time. This comes along in 1852. Now, what's interesting about this time is in another era, this book would have never been written. And here's what I mean by that. Prior to around the 1840s, women couldn't read. You sent your sons to school. The son learned to read. There was no need for the wife to read. You know why? Because she can't vote. She can't own property. I mean, why educate these women, right?
Yep.
Well, suddenly this literacy movement sweeps across America, and women are a beneficiary of that. So much so that by 1860, American women are the most literate population in the world. So as women begin to read, guess what they want to read about? They want to read about love and romance and family. And there's a group of female authors that come out of nowhere and they start writing for the female audience. One of those books happens to be Uncle Tom's Cabin. and it depicts the brutal realities endured by a slave family. By humanizing the enslaved individual, Stowe aimed to evoke empathy from her readers, particularly in the North, making the moral implications of slavery undeniable. So this is incredibly important at the time. Many people that were kind of indifferent to the whole thing, now they can't be indifferent to it anymore. It's in your face. It's brutal. The characters are relatable, and it's just really changes the conversation about slavery. So that's important.
Yep.
Dred Scott, everybody, again, this is probably one you're somewhat familiar with from school. You've heard the term before. Yeah, the Dred Scott decision. It's a big deal. It's a huge deal.
Yep.
Huge deal. 7-2 Supreme Court decision ruled that African Americans had no citizenship rights, whether enslaved or free. You could not be a citizen of the United States. Therefore, you had no right to sue the federal government. And I encourage anybody to read more into the Dred Scott decision, because this is an interesting one. Scott was born in 1799 in Virginia. He was sold a few different times. He ends up in the custody of a U.S. Army officer by the name of John Emerson. And John Emerson, because he's an Army officer, I think he was a surgeon, he gets posted to different places that are free states.
Okay.
Illinois, I think Michigan, somewhere up there. I don't know, Yankeedom, somewhere up there. And as he's doing all that, Dred Scott and his wife and ultimately his children, that he allows Dred to get married. I know that's a terrible thing to say, but one of his buddies officiates the wedding, who's a white man. They, even though his marriage to his wife had no legal standing, he was recognized in the eyes of him and all of their friends. Dred and his wife and children live in a little house near the Army officer. He rents him out his labor. And when he moves back, he's like, I've been free for quite some time now. And so he files for his freedom, sues, and ultimately the Dred Scott decision is handed down in 1857. One of the final things that makes the war happen. So no citizenship for Africans, Americans of African descent. They have nothing. The court also held that enslaved people were considered property under the Constitution. Therefore, slave owners had the right to take their enslaved people into any territory they wanted without losing their ownership rights, which is a big deal because remember, oh, this is a slave state. This is not a slave state. Now that you have the Constitution going, no. That's that man's property. He can take him anywhere he wants. And lastly, that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, stating that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in any territory. This effectively opened all territories to the possibility of slavery. I mean, this was huge.
Yes.
While we're going to war. Lastly, John Brown's raid. Everybody's probably familiar with this. I won't go into it. John Brown is a devout abolitionist, and he goes and takes over a federal armory in Harper's Ferry, and he's trying to lead a slave revolt. Now, this scares the hell out of the South, terrifies them. Because the Haitian Revolution is not a distant memory for these people. It just happened. So was the Nate Turner's Rebellion in 1831. And there were dozens, if not hundreds, of slave uprisings throughout the Western Hemisphere, leading to the death of thousands and thousands of white slaveholders. So it seems as if their worst fears are about to be realized with this guy. And it's only about 3%, 2 to 3% of the northern people are abolitionists. So this is a small number, which is why you and I have talked about on the show many times. You think it takes a huge amount of people to lead an uprising? No. Very small radicals on both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. And to the whole human nature thing in these uprisings, one of the questions I asked on these tours was, it was one of the tours we did in Franklin. I asked, why didn't the slaves rise up? In Franklin at the time, period of time we were talking about during the tour, 51% of the population was black. I'm like, stronger, right? They're out working every day. The white owners are sitting at their desk doing whatever they do, right?
They had access to farm implements, weapons.
Exactly. And we can look back, farm implements is where you see a lot of the weaponry in Japanese martial arts. Nunchucks, bow staffs, those were farm implements that they turned into weapons. They found systems to use them. And if nothing else, you just beat somebody with a stick, right?
Mhm.
And the answer was, I think, an insight into human nature was like, well, first, many times um, they had the slave population so mentally beat down in their
Stockholm
minds.
syndrome, right?
Yeah, exactly. There was
Mhm.
that part of it. There was also, well, they sold off my part of my family over to a plantation, wherever. And if I rise up here, then they'll go over there and kill my family. Right. So
Yeah,
there
I don't.
was
Maybe I'll push back on that one. I don't think there's
okay.
any. I mean, that might have been something that they thought or feared, and I could understand that as a palpable fear. But at the same
Yeah.
time, I don't think there's any
Right.
precedent
Well,
for that.
and in fairness, the way it was presented was that was the fear.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay.
No,
So
I'll buy that.
yeah,
I,
I
I
didn't say that well.
I think
So
religion is much more of a glue that holds it. You know what I mean?
yes, and they definitely talked about that as well, and the Stockholm syndrome, as you put it,
Mhm.
and the conditioning of the human mind is a funny thing within that Stockholm syndrome. And there was writings, after the Civil War, oh yeah, well they beat that slave, but he had it coming. He wasn't working hard enough. He was misbehaving.
Mhm.
So that mentality, how do you inspire people who have been beaten down like that, literally and figuratively, to rise up?
Yeah.
It's going to be very difficult.
Well, and I go back to Frederick Douglass's amazing book, and he didn't have a problem being a slave until he learned to read.
Mm,
And then he was like, "My God, there's an ocean out there. There's all this stuff is
right.
happening around the
Yeah.
world, and I'm stuck here doing this." And
Yeah.
it made it untenable. And he even like cursed the fact that he could read. Once he's like, "How could you let me read and then keep me in bondage?
Right.
How?"
Yeah.
So it was one of his, the wife of one of his masters is who taught him how to read. And then he would go out and he played with white children, I think in
Hmm.
Baltimore. And he would ask them, "Tell me what that newspaper says. Help me with this word here." So, and they
Hmm.
did.
Yeah.
Um, and there were two southern states where slaves outnumbered the white population. I think it was South Carolina and Mississippi, but I could be wrong. Could be South Carolina and Alabama. If you look at the 1860 United States Census, slave population in southern states was approximately 3.95 million people, or about 35 to 38% of the Confederacy were enslaved human beings. The 11
Hmm.
Confederate states had 316,632 slave owners out of a free population of roughly 6 million, which means about 6% of the free population owned all the Confederate slaves. And we talked about, again, small population controlling
Hmm.
the politics of everything. There were also in the Confederacy roughly 250,000 free black individuals, which is another thing you don't learn about in school. Now, let's talk about voting trends. I think we're getting toward
If
the
we
end
can
here.
if we can go back to that small, just another historical perspective, look at
Hmm.
Nazi Germany.
Yes.
The Nazis were not the majority of the people who were hardcore Nazis, were not the majority of the population, but they controlled a large population through media, propaganda, politics.
Sounds somewhat familiar today.
It does.
Let's talk about the 10th and final thing, and that is the election of Abraham Lincoln. But before we get there, let's go back to the election of 1840. I want to show you what the voting trends look like. I don't see bifurcation here. Do you? It's almost like a shotgun blast as
It
far
is,
as
yes.
who's voting for what. You have the
I
Whigs, the
agree.
Democratic Party, and some third party, and there's no division here.
Hmm.
It's somewhat evenly distributed.
Hmm.
Will Parker says, "Control the lines of communication, control the population."
There you go.
Let's look by the time you get to
Can we go back
1860.
to his comment real fast? Sorry.
Sure, of course.
This is right after Zuckerberg comes out and talks about how
Hmm.
Facebook was pressured in 2020, 2021 over COVID stuff, right?
Right.
And how, oh, we won't do that this time. Well, I mean, that was a gift. I mean, that admission was a gift to the Republican Party. But
Amen.
and then you look at why the uproar over Elon Musk taking over X, because
Hmm.
he's opened it up. They can't control that line of communication anymore. The more
Yeah.
things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah. Ted talks about Abraham Lincoln had to deal with Taney, Chief Justice Taney. He was Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. When secession occurred, activists never touched statues of Taney like they did Robert E. Lee, and they probably should have. Taney's an interesting character in this whole drama because of ex parte merriment, which happens at the start of the Civil War. Taney has an opinion and says he can't enforce it. Lincoln just gives him the middle finger. Taney is from a class of slave-holding Virginians, although by the time he sits on the Supreme Court, he had given up all of his slaves. But he's a man of that time, and he saw people as they were in his time. Tony says there were quite a number of wealthy colored slave owners, even here in South Carolina. Yeah, there were. People of African descent owned slaves. Part of that 250,000 free blacks that were living in the South at the time, they did own slaves. Now, let's back up to 1840. Okay. You see that. Now, let's look what happens by 1860. Ooh, bifurcation is well at hand.
Yes.
Now, we talked about, now, if you can see this, if you're watching, let me tell you what you're seeing here. The blue and the purple are the Democratic Party. I told you previously that in 1860, I think their convention was in April of 1860 in Charleston, South Carolina. The party splits. The Democratic, you have Northern Democrats led by Stephen Douglas, and you had Southern Democrats led by John Breckinridge, who had been the vice president. He was the outgoing vice president under Buchanan. So that really probably led to Lincoln being elected. But you also had this yellow party here, and that's the Constitutional Union Party. Now look at where they are. Does anything, well, let me tell you what they are, and then you tell me if you see something odd here. The Constitutional Union Party was led by a man by the name of John Bell. He was a Tennessean, and his position was, we're going to stay in the Union and leave slavery as it is. End of story.
Okay.
And even the Republican Party at the time, they were founded as an anti-slavery party, but Lincoln was very clear that he didn't intend to do anything with it. He wasn't going to attack slavery, but they're like, yeah, but you're from that party and I can't trust you. So let's take a look at where we see the yellow.
The first thing I see is it's if you will, the border, the Mason-Dixon line. For the most part, there's some down in Alabama there, in Georgia for sure, but I'm seeing more, maybe a group of people who just want, hey, the battles are going to take place where I live. Let's not do this. Am I on track?
They don't know battles are coming. If you had asked them, they're like, nah, what are you talking about?
Okay. Battle. All right. So what's the reasoning behind this group then?
Yeah, I really want to bang that drum home. We know with the pleasure of hindsight that this war is coming. It's going to murder, up to 1 million Americans. They have no idea. Matter of fact, there was one politician that famously said, somebody was trying, I forget some politician was trying to say, we're going to have gallons of American blood spilled over this thing. What might be coming if secession happens. And he said, I'd be more than happy to lend my handkerchief because you won't even be able to pick up all the blood with his handkerchief. Of course, he was insanely wrong, but that was the spirit of the time. Yeah. What I'm getting at with this yellow, look at the Mississippi Delta. See how it races down Mississippi with yellow. You've got Memphis and all of southwestern Tennessee there, even up in parts of Missouri, the most fertile parts of that. You see it northern Georgia and parts of Alabama, all those fertile cotton. You know why? Because that's the planter class. The planter class is saying essentially, yeah, we remain in the Union. Yeah, and slavery keeps going because that was in their best interest. The Constitution protected their rights because Dred Scott had just happened, and they're like, Missouri Compromise is null and void.
Well, and let's dig into that a little. So they want to stay in the Union, but have slavery. So they want to have the, if you will, and forgive me, slavery is terrible. We've put all those disclaimers in there, the business model of slavery. And by being part of the Union, they get to trade with the North. They get the best of both worlds.
They get the best of both worlds. They keep supplying cotton down the Mississippi Delta and up to the Union factories, just like it's always been. So this split, the Democratic Party splitting, and then John Bell's Constitution Union Party really allowed Lincoln to get elected in 1860.
So let's bounce back to that because I have a modern day
Equivalent.
analogy or twist on that. Let's look at Robert F. Kennedy. Now he dropped out, right? But you have RFK Jr. trying to get off the ballot in certain battleground states so that his name
Hmm.
isn't even there, so his votes will swing to Trump, who he has endorsed. And you have
Yeah.
Democrats fighting to keep his name on the ballot for exactly the same reason. This is There are so many parallels here. Now you can't sit there and be like, okay, well, slavery, something obvious like that, right? But if you look at the parallels
Yes.
within the dynamics of the parties and a third party, if you will, a split ticket was eventually, which happened here, is kind of a third party ish dynamic, right?
Mm.
And let's remember, and I hope I'm not stealing some thunder from you, Lincoln did not get a majority.
That's right. Yeah, that's the next slide. But you're absolutely right. He actually won only 39.8% of the popular vote.
Mm-hmm.
About 101,800,000. If you're looking at the slide, you know exactly the numbers, but I don't need to go into it. And John Breckinridge got almost 1 million. If you add Stephen Douglas's and John Breckinridge's numbers, they're getting 2.2 million. So
Yeah.
almost 500,000 more votes than Lincoln.
And
Now,
let's talk about Trump versus Hillary. What was the argument? Well, she won the popular vote.
yeah.
Same thing back then.
And John Breckinridge and Douglas, if you add all the electoral votes won by Breckinridge, Bell, and Douglas, it still does not add up to what Lincoln won. And so what? I mean, the Electoral College is there for a reason, and I support the Electoral College.
I do as well.
Let's take a look at this next slide here. Let's see here. Where did it go? Let's remove that for a second. Let me add it back.
Yeah, since we got a moment while that's loading, I got a couple more I added in on another PowerPoint. I'll throw up there at the very end.
Okay. Let's see. While we're working on this, what does Will Parker say?
Speaking of Lincoln and Douglas, it would be amazing for Trump and Harris to have a no-kidding Lincoln-Douglas debate. Yeah, maybe I won't even go there. It would be amazing. Yes, I'll leave it at that. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
So
let me remove this from the studio and try to add it back in. The Lincoln Douglas debates are incredibly important. It's almost like the Federalist Papers today.
Yes.
I mean, just to see where the mood of the country is kind of swinging. Yeah, it's actually not going to come up there. Huh. I don't understand that. And I have to pull it up. It's the election on Lincoln, and it's the final thing that we're going to need to close this out with it. Although I want you to cover your similarities there.
Is a limitation there with StreamYard and the number of slides, maybe?
Perhaps. So I'm going to
maybe break it out into a separate PowerPoint.
Yeah, I'm going to do that right now.
Let me bear with us here a second, guys.
You want to talk about your stuff real quick? Because I'm just going to talk about Lincoln, and that'll be the end of it.
Okay. Yeah. Let me add this whole one. The joy of a live show, guys. Let me add this in. And this was one of those, it was just yesterday. I was running to the grocery store, and it really struck me. Make sure I got the right stuff here. Actually, the first one I'm going to touch on here once this one adds. I wonder if we got something else going on here. It's processing, moving at the speed of the internet here, guys. There we go. All right. So this was in Franklin. This was a home that the Union took over at the beginning of the battle. The battle happened just off to your left, literally like maybe 50 yards away is where the front line of the battle was. the family that lived here, who, forgive me, I can't remember all the names and some of the facts and figures all blend
Carter,
together.
the Carter House
Carter
at
House. Yes,
Canton.
thank you. Carter House. Thank you. They and I didn't add this picture in. They hid in the basement during the battle. And it's a powerful thing. You walk into the basement where they were, and there are chairs set out with names and ages of the 19 people who hid in this basement. They stayed in there overnight during the battle. The man of the house came up in the morning after they hadn't heard any, battle sounds in hours, and standing on this back porch, and that building you see there is their smokehouse. There were 57 bodies between where this picture was taken in that smokehouse.
Yeah.
Just the brutality of that. Off to the left, off the picture, there was a building that was standing, I think, on a different piece of the property, and all the bullet holes are still there from that battle.
Yes.
Just a very powerful thing. And this one, I almost called you because this was so funny. I'm driving to the grocery store yesterday morning to pick up a few things, and I come across this on the road. Now, I blacked out, and this is middle of Wisconsin, guys. Okay,
Jeez.
and
if you're listening to the podcast, you can't
yeah,
see it.
Sorry.
It's an old work truck that has rebel flags and stuff on it in Wisconsin.
Yeah. And it's let me get to my correct spot here. Bear with me, guys, and I can. So it's basically one of this it's the Confederate battle flag, and it says heritage, not hate, and I can't remember what the other one said. Something.
Kiss my rebel ass.
Yeah. Yep. Sorry, I don't have my glasses handy here. So it's that whole. It's alive and well for much of the population, and this is something you don't normally see in Wisconsin. So I found it rather ironic to run into that yesterday morning on the way to the store, given you and I had just talked about the show leading up to it, and then doing this show. All right, back to I see you got your slide loaded there, brother.
The magic of live television, folks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so let's talk about Lincoln leading up to this. So, and I think I tried to put these in chronological order. So Lincoln, of course, is Republican. He's part of the Republican Party, and we talked about the Democrats split. Well, once it looks like Lincoln's going to get elected on October the 5th, 1860, South Carolina got. Now, I want you to, when you hear these dates, think of the speed at which this happens. I mean, it's lightning fast for that day. Again, goes back to the telegraph, right?
Yep.
So on October the 5th, 1860, South Carolina Governor Gist sends his nephew, states' rights Gist, to carry a message to the other southern states. Now that's kind of interesting. Like, states' rights, you go tell everybody that we're going to secede over our states' rights. Following Lincoln's election on November the 6th, the South felt that there would be no future politically under a Republican administration. So on December the 20th, 1860, South Carolina politicians said, quote, and that's when they seceded, December the 20th, 1860, quote, the secession of South Carolina is not an event of a day. It is not anything produced by Mr. Lincoln's election or by the execution of the fugitive slave law. It is a matter which has been gathering head for 30 years. So he's talking all the way back to the tariff, the 50% tariff 30 years ago. And that's why I'm saying it's an outgrowth of that. So Lincoln gets elected November the 6th. He's not sworn in yet, but he's elected. Looks like he's going to take the oath of office in March. South Carolina says we're done. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all secede by February of 1861. Again, Lincoln ain't even sworn in yet. So Lincoln gets sworn in on March the 4th of 1861. The South fires on Fort Sumter, which is like the remaining holdout of federal garrisons, April the 12th. On April the 15th, 3 days later, Lincoln calls up 75,000 volunteers, and he tells all the states still remaining in the Union, you need to give me people. I need at least 75,000 to suppress the rebellion. This pisses off some of the remaining southern states. So on April the 17th, 2 days later, Virginia's convention voted to secede from the Union, with Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina joining soon after. And also, by Lincoln getting elected, the Republican Party now had a majority in Congress as well. So they had the executive branch and part of the and the Congress as well. So this is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, let's talk about some facts that you don't normally hear about in school about Lincoln. This goes back to Lincoln wrote this in the Chicago Daily Press and Tribune on October the 15th, 1858. So not necessarily a candidate for president yet, but he's a rising star. He says, quote, "I am not, nor ever have I been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermingling with white people. And I will say, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which will ever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior. And I am as much as in any other man in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race."
Now,
And I,
let me just dive into that for a second here, if I can, brother. Let's pull out one part, and we're taking it out of context here, okay? Right? There is a physical difference between the white and black races that will ever forbid the two races living together. If I went out and said that somewhere today, that would be utter racism.
of course it is. It's blatant
And it
racism.
is, right?
It is.
It is. It would be. It is. No two ways about it. That's
I bring
Abraham
this up
Lincoln.
because I've told you before, in my view, Southern view, Lincoln's a tyrant and he's a hypocrite. And you'll see more examples of this briefly here. So when I hear, oh, the great emancipator, and there's a 3-minute clip I found on the History Channel where they're interviewing these people, and they're like, he was just a better person than us guys. He just knew, right? And I'm like, no, this man was an avowed racist. But he was a very astute politician. If you want to say he's a great politician and he used this as a moral charge and won the war, I will agree with that. So he wrote that unequivocally, and he said basically the same things in several debates with Stephen Douglas. So it wasn't just something he wrote in a paper. He also said it with his own mouth, almost word for word. So I had been taught that Lincoln was the first Republican presidential candidate. That's absolutely not true. John Fremont was the first presidential candidate of the Republican Party. He ran for office in 1856. When the war broke out, he gave himself to the Union and became a general. Well, it was Fremont who issued the first Emancipation Proclamation on August the 30th, 1861. And this proclamation declared the freedom of enslaved people owned by individuals who were in rebellion against the United States in the state of Missouri, because he was the military district commander in Missouri. So that was under his power to free those people. Sounds like a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Nope. Lincoln is pissed off, and he wrote to one of his friends about the emancipation of the slaves. He said, quote, "The general should never have dragged the Negro into the war. It is a war for a greater national object, and the Negro has nothing to do with it," end quote. Now, this is a private letter he wrote to one of his homies. So you know what he did then? He fired Fremont and repealed the order. And about 1 year later, he does the same thing because he saw how popular it was. When the word got out that Fremont had done this, the abolitionists in the North went, "Oh my God, finally somebody did it."
Yeah.
So a year later, Lincoln's losing the war, and he can't find enough Union men to go down south and fight just to preserve the Union. So he says, let me pull out Fremont's trick. And he did, almost a year to the day later.
So politicians doing politician stuff doesn't change over time.
Are you shocked?
I'm beyond shocked.
Yeah. Horace Greenlee, who's the editor of the New York Tribune, him and Lincoln are going back and forth to each other. So finally, to make his point, Lincoln writes in one of his competitors' newspapers, the Washington National Intelligencer. This is August the 22nd, 1862. So this is a year This is around the time that Emancipation Proclamation is written. I think it comes out in September of 1862, goes into effect January of 1863. Lincoln wrote, quote, "My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft expressed personal wishes that all men everywhere could be free." So again, about a week or so later, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's just showing you where his head's at, right?
For sure. And that's important context because that I will tell, as a northerner, especially growing up in Illinois, the land of Lincoln,
Mm-hmm.
on a pedestal, right?
So let's
Nothing
say
negative about Lincoln ever. I don't
ever.
remember anything ever being negative about Lincoln. Nothing.
No. And so you say, well, that's just as a politician, Rich. Well, let's look at Lincoln as a lawyer. He represented a slave owner trying to get his slave back. He actually lost the case, but he had no moral qualms with representing a man who wanted to re-enslave someone who was now free. And then, and I believe this was in the late 1864, a year or so after the Emancipation Proclamation, which, by the way, freed no one because all it did was free those who were already in the Confederate States, which is another important thing. The Emancipation Proclamation freed 0 people, which is sad, but a fact.
Yeah.
He wrote a peace commission draft to see if the Confederacy would agree to a restoration of the Union with or without slavery. And this was after the Emancipation Proclamation. So if the Confederates would have bought off on it, he would have had to rip that document up. And that's in, again, late 1864. So anytime I hear Lincoln is the great emancipator, I just cringe. That's not the case.
Yeah.
I've got more stuff, but I will say that for another time. Let's talk about similarities for today, my friend.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's first. I've been taking notes all along here because my memory isn't what it once was. So let me put my my cheaters on here so I get this right. We were talking about generations, right? And one thing that came out as we were down there is it's easy to be like, well, it's 150 years. Oh, that's 5 generations, 6 generations, right? Well, 3 generations ago was World War II. Right. So, and you can trace back, and many Southerners can trace back. Well, it was my great grandfather, great grandfather, whatever it was, four or 5 generations back. I can't do that. Yeah. There were soldiers from Illinois and Iowa and Wisconsin, but I can't do that. And I suppose I could if I ever had, but it's not instilled in us in the North. At least not in me. I shouldn't speak for the whole North. Okay. The other thing in driving around during this trip, and it goes back to my why don't they just get over it perception that I had for years. It's everywhere. Like we drove from Shiloh to Corinth, and that's 35-ish minute drive. I counted 7 markers, historical markers on the way, and we're going back roads, guys. I mean, there's no direct way between those 2 points. And it's, this trail was used by whoever it was, right? So it's in your face every day in the South. That's not the case up here at all. I mean,
which is wild.
I would go years at a time and never think about it up here because there is no, there might be a marker somewhere, right? I think about the Korean War more often than I think about the Civil War, only because one of the routes I drive regularly has a Korean War memorial right off the interstate.
Yeah.
So I actually think about the Korean War more only because I happen to see that, right? Well, you flip that around, as a Southerner drives around, all you see is that equivalent of that Korean War memorial 3, 4, 5 times a day driving around somewhere in Tennessee. So I think that's an important distinction here between the North and South on this.
Can I speak to that real quick?
Please
And
do.
even the North, like Wisconsin, Illinois, those states were not necessarily divided. They sent troops to Lincoln. They fought here. There was no, if there were people that had sympathies for the South, they certainly didn't grab a rifle and fight. But if you go to my town square here in Cumberland County, Tennessee, there's the Civil War marker that has the names in bronze of everybody that
Mhm.
died. There's hundreds that died for the Union and hundreds that died for the Confederacy right there next to each other. So it was the division here that was also equally painful. There was not a unified idea of what this nation is and what it was going to be about and what property should and should not be. So
Yes. Yep.
it's a
And
schizophrenic kind of way of looking at it, I guess.
yeah, and so that division is live and well. And be like, after you know Johnny went and fought for the Confederacy, and Joe went and fought for the Union, the family's been split ever since.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That
Yeah,
doesn't
100%.
happen. I mean, I don't recall any stories of that ever happening up here in the North. And then the last thing I want to bring up is history books. Earlier you mentioned history books are written by the victor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I brought that up at this tour with this genealogist, and she kind of chuckled, and she's like, "Well, not always." I'm like, "Well, what do you mean?" I mean, that's the common perspective. And she goes,
Mm-hmm.
"Well, this is me adding this part in, before the Department of Education became a thing and textbooks got somewhat standardized, it was Southern women, because that was what was left after the Civil War, a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of, in her words, bitter, vengeful Southern women wrote the history books." And
Mm-hmm.
so the Southern history books, uh, she described this. I could not find a picture of it, so I'm taking her word for it. Showed a slave getting off a ship dressed in European style clothes, carrying a suitcase, shaking hands with the slave owner. That book was still being published in 1958. Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah. I mean, I've asked my
from
dad what he learned, right, in
mm-hmm,
school
yeah,
during that time. Like you said, it was before the Department of Education. So what did you learn?
yeah,
And it was the lost cause doctrine. The
okay,
slavery had nothing to do with it.
yeah, and so but this also goes back to the why not get over it? Well, up until
Mhm,
1958, children were being taught that image of
mhm,
slavery, not the reality of it with the slave ships and the horrors that happened on those slave ships, right? So as a northerner, in say 1970, I would go to the South and run into somebody who was taught that and be
mhm.
like, "Why don't you get over it? It was terrible." And he's like, "No, in my history book, it showed this."
Right.
That's a huge dichotomy right there.
Yeah.
So it's something to really keep in mind on what are people being taught.
Yeah. And,
So
and they should be taught because there's so much to this. Like 7,000 Union soldiers were killed in 20 minutes at the Battle of Cold Harbor.
mhm,
7,000 in
mhm,
20 minutes. That's double what we lost in the Iraq and Afghanistan war over 20 years. That's 20 minutes.
yeah,
12,401 Union men were killed, missing, or wounded, double the casualties of D-Day in just the first day of battle at Antietam. And I'm not talking about total Americans killed,
yeah,
23,000 killed, wounded, missing, etc. casualties. 23,000 if you add up the Confederacy, just the Union. So
yeah,
it's a horrific tragedy that
yes,
I don't know why most Americans like I don't want to think about it. I want to look at it.
yeah. Well, because I think some of that is people are uncomfortable with that, but also, so especially here in the North, it's settled. It's
Oh
settled
yeah,
history. So why
yeah,
bother?
right,
And let's face it, at this point, it's quote unquote ancient history, right?
yeah,
So, and to your point of your numbers, if you can bring that slide deck back up on mine, go to the
that one.
yep, and then go forward to the end of that one. 'Cause this is a
Hmm.
picture I took at Shiloh. Um, and this was I kind of refer to it as an accidental battle after learning
Hmm.
very I mean I know very little about it in the big picture of things, but it wasn't supposed to be a big battle. It just kind of turned out that way, and reinforcements showed up at the right time on both sides and back and forth across this. It spanned 2 days total, not a
Yep.
full 48 hours, but it spanned 2 days with 26,000 dead, wounded, or missing.
Yeah. Can I put that in context?
Please do.
That total right there is more than all previous American wars combined.
Yes.
That is insane. The Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican American War, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Combine all those, you still don't have as many
Yep.
casualties as you had in less than 48 hours in the Battle of
Yep.
Shiloh, which
And
again
they
was not a major. It was just a, like you said, in the military we call it a meeting engagement, where two armies just slam into each other. They didn't expect it, and the ground's not favorable for anybody. It's just a shit show.
And they went back and forth and walking those battlegrounds. And there's the first one that we stopped at. I forget the name of the field, and I mean no disrespect to those who fought there. We stood on one side of the field, and this was originally farming area, so there was cleared land, and the wooded areas didn't have underbrush because they let their livestock go out and graze through the trees, so all the underbrush was gone. So you could see 150 yards through a tree line. And the town I live in, little town, about 4,000 people, this one engagement that I'm referring to, they were on opposite sides of this field, which I'm going to say is 175, maybe 250 yards apart from these tree lines. And the way and this is part of when you talk to people, when any of you guys talk to people, try to bring history alive. So I asked my kids, how many people live in our town? And they said about 4,000. I said, imagine seeing our entire town come out of that other tree line. And you've got like 150 or 175 guys. Terrifying.
Terrifying.
Right? So they turn tail and run, showing common sense, right? And then they go back, reinforce their lines, and then it goes back and forth. So, it just the carnage at Shiloh, and as you walk the battlefields and realize many times, I mean, they were on top of each other, and there was hand to hand there. Terrible stuff.
And we talk a lot about Shiloh, and Shiloh is important. I've obviously been there many times, being a Tennessean, because Shiloh is here in Tennessee. But there was a battle every single day somewhere during the 4 years of the Civil War, to a total of 10,455 military engagements, over 10,000 battles fought during the Civil War. Again, the context being that, like I said at the very beginning, this is where divisions go. And if you look at that map, that voting map of 1860, it looks eerily similar to where we are now. The divisions, the balkanization, and this is where this goes. So, and Will says
also go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Will says Shiloh was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War to that date. Ultimately, Antietam was worse, but not by much.
Yeah. So if you go back to the slide deck I put together, and then let's look at comparisons here.
Yeah.
So this is just, I threw this together off the top of my head here, guys. So this was not some deeply thought out thing, because sadly we don't have to think this out very far to see similarities. A country divided. And as we alluded to earlier, it's not so much geographic anymore, but urban versus rural. We've talked about that. That's out there as a common thing right now, common thought process. Media sources playing to their respective bases to solidify support for a given candidate. Example, let's look at the current proposal to tax capital gains. Okay. They're from the right. I'm going to be critical of Fox News here. They're making it sound like everybody is going to get their capital gains taxed. That is not the case. It's people with, more than $100 million. Now, that doesn't mean I'm in favor of it. I think it's wrong. I should say unrealized capital gains here. I should specify that. Regular capital gains are taxed at all levels. But the problem with that is Fox is playing to their base, right? And I've seen the memes out there, and I've corrected a few people and been like, no, it's still a bad idea, but it's not what Fox is making it out to be. On the flip side of that, it will eventually affect everybody, because let's remember, when the federal income tax was put into place, it was meant to catch the top 1% or 2% of the wage earners at that time in 1913. How's that working out?
Yeah.
And the alternative minimum tax, which is more recent history, I believe was 1967, was originally put in place to capture taxes for, I believe it was 168 tax returns, families, if you will. How's that working out? By 2010, it was something like 65, 70%. Again, it's that look at the history. It'll end up there, right? And which way do we see taxes going, period? Okay, I'm getting off track, sorry. But it is the media playing to their bases, right? That increases division, a threat moving towards some sort of conflict. Hotly contested election, in case anyone hadn't noticed. And you've got Biden dropping out / being forced out. There's a great clip out there with Bill Maher interviewing Nancy Pelosi. Some of you may think I need a drug test after saying that, but he calls her out for it. He alludes to Pelosi forcing Biden out, and she denies it without denying it, and he says, "Well, thank you for not doing what you didn't do," and she laughs. So, there's something going on there, right? So, many people, including a lot of them that we know on both sides, are entrenched beyond what the North versus South was in 1860, in my opinion. And of course, social media and the regular media gen this up, same as they did back then. Not Facebook was pretty rudimentary back then. It was pamphlets, right?
Yeah.
Arguably, a breakdown in the current system of selecting candidates. Okay. As Bill Maher said, you can count the number of delegates Harris got in 2016. Was it 2016? Yeah. No, 2016. Sorry. No, 2020. When in the primaries, you can count the number of delegates she got on one hand as long as you cut off all your fingers.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So and that's Bill Maher saying that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, but then she gets anointed. Well, where do the left is definitely falling in behind her, but the right is going, hold on, this isn't how it's supposed to work. And the right is, I believe, correct in this case, right? Trump didn't attend a single debate or materially participate in the primary process, and he won. Is that how it's supposed to work? Okay. So I'll call Trump out on that. In my opinion, he should have gone to the debates, period. Maybe some people would have chosen other people. Who knows, right? And of course, there was the assassination attempt on former President Trump, which if that had succeeded, that would have been terrible. First in his death, anybody's death, but then also what that would have meant politically and where we would have gone from there. And of course, there's all kinds of things within that could be another 2-hour show. So that's that's the parallels I'm drawing. What is your takeaway on that, brother?
No, the final thing I would say is when we talk about history, and do you know Arlington National Cemetery? Do you know where that comes from?
I do not know.
That was Robert E. Lee's home.
Really?
Robert E. Lee's home. And when he left it to go and, fight for the Confederacy, the Union Army moved in and was, out of respect, was trying to preserve it for the longest time. Well, the quartermaster general who's in charge of it, I think his name was Meigs, and Meigs' son gets killed in 1864 fighting for the Union. So General Meigs, who's the Union general in charge of watching over Robert E. Lee's estate there at Arlington, has his son buried there. Because at the time he was thinking maybe Robert E. Lee's going to come back and reoccupy his home. And he's like, I want him to look at my son every damn day. And of course, Robert E. Lee's home remained captured. More people, they were already burying some people there, but I think his son was the first one buried in the officers section. So I say that to say, just adds on to the pain of where this thing can go. And Robert E. Lee, that shows the passion too of the time that these men, many of them were educated in the North, had gone to the best colleges in the North, and yet they still felt that their state was their country. And if you read their writings, that's the way they refer to it. My country's Virginia.
Yes.
And Virginia happens to be in this confederation of things called the United States, but My country is Virginia. I don't know about yours.
And
Um,
I'm glad you brought that up because that was brought up many times on the tours that we took.
mm,
And I'll tell you from a northern perspective, no, not even now. I mean, the United States is my country, not Wisconsin, not Illinois, not Iowa, not
yeah.
anywhere else I've lived. It wouldn't even register for me.
I fly an American flag now, but for the most of the time on our homes, I flew a Tennessee flag. I'm
Hmm.
just giving an anecdotal. I didn't think about it. I'm just like, even though I was an officer of the United States government, and had
Hmm.
Title 10 authority, I still was like, my loyalty is to Tennessee.
Yeah, and
And
up here in the north, occasionally I'll see a Wisconsin flag, but if you do, I can't remember a single time I've ever seen just a Wisconsin flag flown in a yard, and that was very common when I was in Tennessee.
yeah,
If you
it's
see it here in
it's
Wisconsin, there's an American flag and a Wisconsin flag.
and I look at it like the EU, the EU, it's very similar to the way I perceive the United States back then. So Brexit to me is more like what we did, secession. We're leaving the
Hmm.
EU. The economic conditions aren't right for us. Have a nice day.
Hmm.
And I think that's the way the 94, 93% that didn't own slaves in the South probably looked at it. Like the economic conditions are not right. You're
Hmm.
prohibiting our property. Of course, that property was
Hmm.
the immoral practice of slavery. But if a man can't take his property anywhere he wants, that doesn't even have property. These United States don't even recognize our rights. So um, have to put yourself in their time. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. Matter of fact, I will say it was wrong, of course,
Yep,
now with
for
21st
sure.
century. But you know what?
Yep.
150 years from now, our future ancestors may not eat meat, and they may think, oh my God,
Yeah.
animals have a soul. Oh my God, great great
Right.
grandpa Will ate pigs and just weep over it. I mean, we
And they
can't
were
know how
delicious.
we're. I know we can't know how we're going to be judged in the future, but that's
Exactly.
all I have, man. That's all I have.
Yeah. So you touched on it. I'm going to bring it up here. I promised that we'd go back to Joseph's comment here.
Mm,
He said he's going there. If Lincoln was a Republican, why are only 12% of Black Americans Republicans and only 25% own firearms today? He says, being Black himself, the Constitution, its amendments are his second Bible.
yep.
You know, and that's a change over time. Media, politicians, um, I will say cynically, promising people things, right?
Mhm.
So there, and a lot of people just don't understand their history. Period.
No,
Doesn't
they
matter
don't.
race, creed, religion. They don't understand their history, and it shapes so much. Like the voting map you showed for was it Georgia there with
Mhm.
the swath of blue right through the counties where they grew cotton, right?
Yeah.
So it just it's amazing how all this ties together, and our schools do not do a good job of teaching this, which of course then cynically I'll say, well, yeah, Department of Education is doing a great job, right?
Yeah. They're doing a
So,
terrible job because if you, during the Reconstruction period, one of my favorite Americans of this time period is a former slave named Robert Smalls.
mhm,
Um, by hook or by crook, he gets out and he takes over a Confederate ship like by himself. And
mhm.
I mean, the
Great
guy's just,
story.
oh, he's amazing.
He's a stud.
Um, he's a stud. And he becomes a very rich man after the Civil War. He becomes a politician. He's a Republican. A lot of you got people don't know this in the Reconstruction era. You had a lot of black Republican congressmen and senators, and then that fades out, and you don't see that again. Jim Crow laws come
Mhm.
in, and there's some other awful things that are done to these people. But to was it Joseph? To Joseph's point,
Yeah.
if I think if the African Americans really knew their history, I don't think they would speak so favorably of the Democratic Party. Specifically, look at what LBJ had to say
Oh.
about why he was
Hmm.
giving. I can't use that language on this
Yeah.
show. Won't
Yep.
do it. It's
Yep.
killing me.
Yep. I won't either. Yep. Look it
Uh,
up, guys.
but that was
Why
his.
he went after the Civil Rights Act? Yeah.
It's disgusting.
It is.
The Democrats are not the friend of the black man, and I hate to say
Yep.
that, but that's just history, folks. I don't know
Yep.
how.
It's not there to be liked or disliked. It just is.
It just is. But yeah, read about Dred Scott, read about Robert Smalls, read
Hmm.
Frederick Douglass's amazing narrative of a slave, I think is the name of it. Fantastic.
Hmm.
And that's all I got.
All right.
I
Well,
mean,
I want to bring one.
I've got a whole, I think
No.
we can do a whole nother show I've got on voting trends. I'll just walk you right through to where we are
Yeah.
today. And
Yep.
there we are now. That's 2020.
Yep.
And look at the blue area we talked about where the
Yeah.
old ancient sea.
Yeah. Yep. For
Isn't
sure.
that
Right.
crazy?
Right
It's
down
still
there
there.
in Alabama. It's crazy. It
But
really
we'll have to
is.
do another round too.
Yeah. And let's finish it up here. I'm going to bring Johnny King's comment up from earlier. If the Rikers Island rumor is true, then he'd say we're going to war. Now, of course, what he's referring to is there's rumors out there that Rikers Island is being prepped to um, jail and prison former President Trump.
Mhm.
And those rumors are out there. Now, my cynical side is is that the right putting that rumor out to gen up the base? I don't know. I don't know. They failed to add me in on any of the communications on this. I'm sure it's just an oversight. The But this is, if something like that were to happen, unprecedented, all those things, and the repercussions of that, of one side or the other playing to a base and doing something like that, is would be catastrophic to the country.
Yeah.
You know, it's
We'll says
anyway.
we'll find out next week. But is that the sentencing? I thought it was the 19th.
I
I
thought
don't
so
remember.
too, but I could be wrong on that. I could be way off.
That's going to be a pivotal day, man.
Yep.
We're living through pivotal times. We just don't see it because we're the proverbial uh, frog in the boiling water. And these people didn't see it either. That's why I wanted to lay it out in chronological order. There were things that were present at the founding, all the way right up to the last, to the last minute. And then once it went, that was the other thing. That election of Lincoln, you saw how fast the dominoes started to fall. I mean, it was
Yeah.
from October of 1860 till April. It was we were killing each other wholesale. That's
Yep.
fast.
Yeah, it is. I want to bring up Ted's comment here. There's a bunch of great comments in here. We're already over 2 hours, which might be a record for us.
I think so.
Um, it says, consider adding massive immigration, 500,000 a year in 1860 North, South, or free Western states. Well, that's basically what's happening now with our southern border, right? Which I'm guessing is what Ted's alluding to. And those folks are coming in and they're being met by left-leaning NGOs and being told how to get their asylum, how to sign up for benefits, and things like that. And which way do you think they're going to vote?
Can we
And
talk
of
about
course,
that?
Republicans are against that. But I bet if they voted right, suddenly the Republican Party would find a way to squint at that and be in favor of it.
Yeah, since we are 2 hours over, I'll give some historical context. I did a little bit, that 1.6 million immigrants came in. And again, that's a lot. But if you consider the size of the United States at the time,
Mm-hmm.
it mirrors the influx we see now. Okay. That
Yep.
1.6 million. They were Irish, they were Catholic. The Protestant work ethic did not take well to wage labor. I talked about it,
Mm.
wage slavery.
Yep.
It tore at the
Yep.
fabric of what was the Protestant work ethic, and the fact that the Catholics were willing to do that for pennies was anathema to the way the Southern Protestants saw things. And again, who was the beneficiary of the immigrant labor? The North. 90% of them went to northern cities and worked in northern factories. And then if you look also at the Union Army, 30% of the Union Army that fought in the Civil War were comprised of immigrants and former slaves. 30%.
Mm.
So, and that tells you how popular Lincoln's idea of restoring the Union was. He couldn't find enough people to do it. So he took the Irish right off the boats, gave them a rifle, and sent them to Shiloh or wherever.
Yeah.
So it's a mess, but it mirrors today exactly.
It
Similar.
does. I want to hit a couple more here if we can. Johnny King says even SEC sports have an allegiance to their conference, and we see we're tribal. Humans are tribal. You're looking for a tribe, right? Look at any sport. I mean, up here by me, you got the Packers, right?
Mhm.
I mean, we know they're the best football team in the world. It always has been, always will be America's team. The Cowboys suck. But look at that. Literally up here in Wisconsin, kids, the one I'm thinking of right now is little girls will get their school pictures taken dressed as a Packer cheerleader, and
Wow.
that's not, that doesn't raise anybody's eyebrows up here. Okay,
Mhm.
you know, so we're tribal people, and I want to bring up Bruce's comment here too. Says thanks for the history lesson. Well, I just gave some perspective from up here. Rich did all the heavy lifting on this one for sure. So
I tell you, like I said, this forced me to look at the cause more than I'd ever done before. I normally get caught up in from a military perspective, what was going on the ground and what the soldiers felt and thought and saw. So I had to really kind of change my aperture, and it was a learning experience. And hopefully, it has given some insights to you guys, because this was a really, really brutal time. I don't
mhm.
think we can appreciate it now. Even after the Civil War, 20,000 Southerners immigrated to Brazil to try to just to get, because
Mhm.
they're like, okay, well, yeah, you think the war's settled? We're out of here. And again, 20,000 people out of a few million is a lot of people that left to Brazil, and they started a little town there called Americana,
Mhm.
and to this day, they're still down there. They every year they have a celebration of their southern roots. Um, the 10th president, John Tyler, supported the Confederacy, as did John Breckinridge and many other people at the time, because they thought it was constitutionally within the power of a state to go.
Mhm.
Because even if you look at the language at the time, the United States of America are is the way it was written. It was always written
Mhm.
that way. The United States of America are, meaning plural. After the Civil War, it became the United States of America is. It truly made us as a
Mm.
nation,
Yeah.
an indivisible nation. Whereas before, I think they really thought they were a collective league, and they could
Mhm.
come and go as they pleased.
Yeah. Well, that's the way it's set up, and you look at Mark Levin is the big push for a convention of states right now,
Mhm.
and so are we going back to, will that division become codified constitutionally? Don't know,
I don't know.
but it's something to keep an eye on, and no matter how it goes, it's got the potential to turn ugly. I mean, you bring this that map back up with the county, the red and blue counties.
Mhm.
It is that it is that division, and I travel a lot, and you see it.
Can
I drove around. I was chasing down parts for a DIY project yesterday, so I spent almost 2.5 hours on the road driving the different suppliers. I saw two homes. Now I live in a more rural area. I saw exactly two homes with left leaning political signs.
hmm,
Now, could a lot of the left leaning folks not be putting it out there because, they just don't want to put it out there? Absolutely true. Okay. And I live in a very purple county, very purple,
mhm,
but Trump stuff everywhere.
mhm.
And it furthers that division. It's one reason I don't put out political signs. First, I don't think they do any good personally. I could be totally wrong about that. The other thing is, I'm just not that. I'm not looking. If I've got a neighbor down the street who I like who leans left, I'm not going to set up that division.
Yeah. No, not either. I want to get to Don's part, but before we do, you asked me to bring these up. So let's just kind
Yeah.
of, I'm going to slowly scroll through. So this is 1840. We talked about that. There's
Go ahead.
1844, 1848. Now, 1852. Now it seems like it's getting a little bit more bifurcated.
Yep.
1856, the Republican Party comes on the scene. You got the American Party, which is interesting. Let me go back to that. There was something called the Know Nothing Party and the American Party.
Mm-hmm.
These were nativist parties that hated immigration. They were completely against it. Matter of fact, if you watch the movie, the Martin Scorsese movie Gangs in New York, you see Bill the Butcher, and
Mm-hmm.
he's
Mm-hmm.
telling Tammany, like, if I could, I'd shoot every one of them as they come off the boat. So that's these yellow counties here.
Okay.
And then, of course, we looked at 1860. We got the blue and the purple is the bifurcation of the Democratic Party, splitting into factions: the North faction and the Southern faction, and the Constitution Party. Um, and then you see 1872 comes around. The Civil War's over. It's been over for about 7 years. And look at this. It looks like the sectionalism is somewhat gone. you're
Yeah.
back to that scattershot of Democrats and Republicans and kind of the way it
Mhm.
should be. And now let's go forward in time. Ooh, by 1904, look what happens. Let me go back.
Wow.
Bang.
I mean, you're only talking about 32 years there.
I know. And it's like, oh shoot. And look at that. The whole
Mhm.
South is Democrat. And those are the Dixiecrats, right?
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
1920, we move ahead. We're getting into the roaring 20s. 1968, look at this. What's
Hmm.
that yellow party? That's George Wallace. And George
Wow.
Wallace, yeah, look how much he took.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we know that Wallace was anti-segregation. He came from the Democratic Party, folks, but he was more out on the hard wing of the Democratic Party and took a lot of votes up. And then here we
Mm-hmm.
are today.
Yep.
And what's interesting about today is we say we're bifurcated, but really, as we've talked about before, it's a collection of city states.
Yes.
These little cities acting as states because they have such population density.
Right.
If you looked at this map, you go, oh, we live in a Republican country with a few
Mm-hmm.
Democratic city states, and that's basically
Yep.
what it is.
Yep. And which brings back that map is exactly why I favor the electoral college.
Yeah,
Tyranny of the majority.
yeah. Don says for a sense of bravery, we as Americans on both sides displayed in that war. Just walk one of the battlefields, look at the artillery batteries, and see the ground that the infantry had to charge across to capture them. That open space will make your hair stand up when you consider grape shot flying across it.
Yes.
Just as an example of how accurate he is, this is something I didn't know until I'm reading a new book called Shrouds of Courage or Shrouds of Glory, something like this. It's written by the same guy that wrote Forrest Gump. It's a fantastic book. Anyway, he says that in the Civil War they fought as corps, and each
Mhm.
corps on either side would be roughly 15 to 20,000 men.
Okay.
And each soldier in that corps could load and fire 2 rounds a minute.
Mhm.
So you had 60,000 rounds flying a minute. 60,000 50
Mhm.
caliber rounds flying with deadly accuracy a minute, and nothing to stop it. And then on top of that, grape shot and other things when you got in close.
Mhm.
So that's why the wounds were so horrific. That's why the casualties were so horrific. That's how you could have 7,000 casualties in 20 minutes of Cold Harbor.
Yep.
But
And it
let
was the
us never
warfare,
go back.
right? And it was the warfare of the time. You stand in the open and shoot at one another. Seeking cover, we think again. We think of it
Cowardly.
as so obvious, right? It is cowardly.
Yeah.
I'll be a coward. I want to get something. I'm going to get behind something.
Well,
Yep.
and to that point, it's easy to be a coward in today's military because nobody around you is from your hometown. However, then you were fighting with men from your hometown. Everybody there was part of the Maori County. Here would be the Cumberland County Rifles, and the Cumberland County Rifles would enlist and fight together. And these are men that were on your street. They knew your wives back home. You knew theirs.
Yep.
So you ain't going to be a coward in front of the people you grew up with. Just especially for Southern men with their honor and their sense of
Mhm.
elan, and they considered themselves different than the Yankee hordes, that
Yep.
they had more spirit and more what have you. So no, it's just not going to do it. There were people selling plates back then that would stop bullets.
Really?
Yeah, they sold them, but nobody bought them because it's like, no, I'm not gonna do that. That's dishonorable. I'm going to eat the lead head on.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. And it is. And I never thought about that perspective of the military then versus the military now.
Mhm.
That's a awesome perspective. Thank you. So,
And well, I could go all day about this.
yep.
It's a topic near and dear to my heart. So you're gonna have to shut me off at some point.
All right. Well, I think maybe a part 2 and part 4, 5, 6 at some point as we head along here. So, for sure. How about you take us out, brother?
Guys and gals out there, remember the division can tear this country apart. It's done it before, it can do it again. So be ready because the fight may be coming.